The room was a spectacle of towering arrogance. Aliens of various shapes and forms, beings from worlds far more advanced than Earth, filled the circular council chamber. Their eyes gleamed with superiority, the kind that only centuries of technological dominance could breed. They did not speak to one another as equals. They engaged in a silent war of unspoken hierarchies, where each knew their place in the galactic pecking order. For some, the sense of self-importance radiated like the light from a dying star, decayed and distant, but still blinding. At the center of it all stood the holographic projection of a planet, Earth, small, insignificant, and utterly unremarkable. To most in the room, it may as well have been a speck of dust on the fabric of space, something to be brushed aside with indifference. One alien, with smooth, iridescent skin, regarded the planet with an almost casual disdain. "The humans," he began, his voice laced with boredom, "are a species barely worth mentioning in this chamber. They cling to their fragile planet like insects to a leaf. Their technology, if you can even call it that, is laughable. Their ships, made of alloys fit for children's toys, dare to navigate the stars." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One species, whose form was so gaseous it seemed they could evaporate at any moment, bubbled with derisive laughter. "Their ambitions are delusions," said another, their voice reverberating like a vibrating chord. "What can these primitive creatures hope to achieve?" The council leader, a being with 3 luminescent eyes, gestured toward the projection. "Their fleet is minuscule, outdated. They're not a threat to the peace of the galaxy, nor do they offer anything of value to our collective advancement. Why do we waste our time even discussing them?" Another voice cut through, a species with jagged scales and eyes that glowed like embers in a darkened hearth. "It's the arrogance of the young," they snarled. "They believe they can claim the stars simply because they learned to crawl among them." There was a brief silence, one filled with the smug satisfaction of species who had long since proven themselves worthy of cosmic relevance. Earth was a joke. Its people were an anomaly and oddity that had somehow managed to escape their cradle without self-destructing. But it was a matter of time. That was the consensus. The meeting was winding down. The projection of Earth flickered as the discussion shifted to other matters of galactic importance. Trade routes, borders, the flow of energy across star systems. The human race would be forgotten soon enough, reduced once more to the status of a minor footnote in the long history of the cosmos. Elsewhere, far from the cold disdain of the council, Admiral Aiden Valor stood silently aboard the Resolute, his hands clasped behind his back. Through the ship's wide viewport, he watched as the stars slipped by, distant and cold. The weight of command sat heavy on his shoulders, not because he doubted his ability, but because of the sheer magnitude of the task ahead. Earth was not just a planet, it was home, and more than that, it was a promise that humanity would not just survive, but thrive. "Do you ever wonder," a voice behind him asked, "if we're chasing something we'll never catch?" Aiden turned, his eyes meeting those of Captain Elara Quinn. She stood at attention, her uniform crisp, her expression betraying none of the doubt she had just voiced. She was ambitious, fiercely so, but even she couldn't hide the undercurrent of frustration that gnawed at her. Aiden regarded her for a moment before speaking. "What is it you think we're chasing, Captain?" "Respect. Recognition," she said. "Everywhere we go, every system we pass through, they look at us like we're children playing a game we don't understand. It's like they're waiting for us to fall, just so they can say, 'I told you so.'" Aiden turned back to the viewport, his gaze steady. "Let them think what they want. We have our own path to walk." Alara's voice softened, though the tension in it remained. "And what if that path leads nowhere? What if we're just wrong?" For a moment, the silence between them was thick. The only sound the distant hum of the ship's engines. Aiden broke it with a quiet certainty. "We're not wrong. They think they know us, but they've never faced what we've faced. They don't know what we're capable of because they've never had to." Elara moved to stand beside him, her arms crossed. "They've seen our ships, Aiden. They've seen what we have to offer, and they've already dismissed us." "They've seen what we let them see," Aiden said. And that's what they'll regret. Elara raised an eyebrow. The hidden fleet? Aiden didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the stars, but his mind was elsewhere on the ships hidden deep within the asteroid fields, the advanced technology that no alien had ever glimpsed. The Council thought Earth was weak. They thought humanity had nothing to offer. But there were plans in motion they could not begin to understand. "It's not time yet," he said finally. "When it is, they'll see who we are." Elara's voice was skeptical. "And until then?" "We bide our time. We let them underestimate us." Elara let out a breath, shaking her head slightly. "I hope you're right. I really do. But the galaxy doesn't wait. If we don't act soon, we might not get the chance to prove ourselves." Aiden turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You think we're running out of time?" "I think we're already out of it," she said quietly. "We're just pretending we aren't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken doubts, with the weight of responsibility they both bore. But there was also a quiet determination, a shared understanding that, despite everything, they could not afford to stop. Far away, in the heart of an asteroid belt that no alien ship dared enter, a different kind of fleet lay in waiting. The ships were not the fragile vessels the Council had seen. These were crafted in secret, built with technology that Earth had guarded fiercely for decades. Stealth systems cloaked them in darkness, while their weapons were more advanced than anything the Council could have imagined. They were humanity's true power, its hidden hand. And they were waiting for the right moment. Back on the Resolute, Aiden stood in the war room, reviewing the latest intelligence. Reports from the Council were coming in regularly now. They were planning something, a major offensive, perhaps. But it didn't matter. Whatever they were planning, they would never see what was coming. Elara entered, her face grim. "We've intercepted more communications," she said, handing him a data pad. "The Council is growing more confident. They think we're irrelevant." Aiden glanced at the reports, but his expression didn't change. "Good," he said. "Let them think that." Elara frowned. "You really believe we can win this, don't you?" Aiden didn't hesitate. "I know we can. We've been underestimated before. This is no different." Elara nodded slowly, though the doubt in her eyes hadn't entirely faded. "And if we're wrong?" Aiden looked at her, his gaze steady. "We're not." There was no bravado in his words, no need for embellishment. It was a simple fact, spoken with a quiet confidence of someone who had seen what others hadn't. And that was the difference, Aiden thought. The Council could mock them, dismiss them, ridicule them. But they didn't know humanity, not really. They had never seen what humans were capable of when pushed to the brink. They would soon enough. The message came in the form of a crisp transmission, delivered with a kind of formality that felt like a sneer. Aiden sat in the briefing room, the lights dim, the Council's holographic seal floating above the table. Elara stood beside him, silent but fuming. The words had been read out twice now, and neither of them had moved. "The Galactic Council invites the fleet of Earth to participate in a diplomatic demonstration," the transmission had said, though the intent was clear. This was no invitation. It was a challenge, a test wrapped in the silk of politeness. It was a way for the Council to prove, once and for all, that humanity was not ready to stand among the stars. Elara crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "Diplomatic demonstration," she muttered, pacing slowly. "They might as well come out and say it. Show us your toys so we can laugh at them." Aiden didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the projection, the words still hanging in the air, but his thoughts had moved elsewhere. To the Council chamber, where aliens had mocked them, dismissed them. To the unspoken certainty that they had already decided how this would end. They were offering humanity a stage, not to showcase their strength, but to ensure their defeat would be public and undeniable. "It's a trap," Elara said, her voice growing sharper. "They're setting us up to fail. We know it, they know it." Aiden stood, his movements deliberate and slow. "Of course, they are." "Then why are we even considering this?" Elara demanded, her frustration bubbling to the surface. They want us to embarrass ourselves. They want to make an example of us. Aiden turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. That's exactly why we're considering it. Elara's eyes narrowed. You can't be serious. You want to play into their hands. No, Aiden said, stepping closer. I want them to think we are. She stared at him, a mix of disbelief and frustration on her face. You want them to mock us in front of the entire galaxy, and you think that'll help us? Aiden's voice remained level. What they want is to confirm their belief that we're weak. If we refuse, it'll be seen as proof that we can't stand with them. If we accept, they think we'll fail. And what if we do fail? Elara asked, her voice sharp. We won't, Aiden replied simply, because we won't play by their rules. Elara's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, but she kept it in check. You've got a plan, then? Aiden nodded. They're expecting us to show off our fleet, what they think is our fleet. But they've never seen what we're really capable of. Elara's brow furrowed, the tension between them thickening. And you think they'll let us walk away if we win? You think they'll just accept that we belong? Aiden's gaze didn't waver. No, but that's not the point. Elara paused, her frustration mingling with curiosity. Then what is the point? Aiden turned back to the holographic seal, his expression unreadable. The point is to make them question everything they think they know. The briefing room fell into silence again, save for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Elara finally exhaled, folding her arms tightly against her chest. You're playing a dangerous game, Aiden. We've always been playing a dangerous game, he replied, without missing a beat. Elara shook her head. This isn't just about winning a battle. This is about making a statement, a public one. If we go out there and fail, the Council will use it as evidence to shut us out of every future negotiation, every alliance. And if we succeed, they'll still hate us, Aiden said, his voice quiet but certain. Elara stared at him, confused by his calm acceptance. Then why risk it? Why give them the opportunity to humiliate us? Aiden's eyes flicked over to her, a hint of something deeper in his gaze. Because this isn't about them, it's about us. Elara hesitated. What do you mean? Aiden stepped away from the table, the weight of his thoughts becoming clearer. Humanity has never been respected, not in our own history, not by those who've ruled over us, and certainly not by those who now rule the galaxy. Every time we've been underestimated, every time they've looked at us as nothing more than a lesser species, we've surprised them. He paused, letting the silence fill the room. We've always been the underdog. It's in our nature to fight against the odds. And this is no different. They think they know us. They think they understand what we're capable of because they've seen our ships, our technology. But they don't know our spirit. They don't know what drives us. Elara listened, her arms slowly uncrossing. There was something about the way he spoke that was grounding. Something that cut through the frustration and made her question her own doubts. You think they're making the same mistake others have? She asked quietly. Aiden nodded. They think they're superior because they've been at the top for so long. They've forgotten what it means to fight for something. For us, every step forward is a battle. Every achievement is a victory against the odds. Elara leaned against the wall, her gaze shifting downward. But how long can we keep doing this? Fighting for scraps, clawing our way up from the bottom. As long as we need to, Aiden said. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. The room fell silent once more, the weight of Aiden's words hanging in the air. Elara glanced at the holographic seal, the challenge still floating before them like a taunt. So we accept. Aiden nodded. We accept. 2 days later, the Council's formal response arrived. The diplomatic demonstration would be held in neutral space, far from any of the galactic powerhouses. It was a public spectacle, one that would be broadcast across the known galaxy. Every major species would have their eyes on it. It was exactly what the Council wanted, a stage upon which to ridicule humanity in front of the entire universe. Aiden stood at the helm of the Resolute, the weight of command pressing against him as the ship prepared to jump. Beside him, Elara was silent, her focus entirely on the task ahead. "We're ready," she said, her voice clipped but steady. Aiden gave a single nod. "Set the course." As the ship's engines hummed to life, the stars ahead seemed to shift and warp, stretching into infinity as the Resolute broke through the fabric of space. It was a routine jump, one they had made countless times before, but this time the destination carried a different weight. The Council had set the terms. They wanted to see what Earth had to offer. Aiden had no doubt that they expected a show of weakness, an easy opportunity to confirm humanity's inferiority. But Aiden knew better. He knew that the Council's arrogance was their blind spot. They believed they had already won this battle before it had even begun. But they hadn't. In the quiet moments before the jump completed, Aiden found himself staring out into the abyss of space. His thoughts drifted back to Earth's history, to the long line of conflicts and struggles that had defined humanity's path. Time and time again, those who underestimated them had paid the price. They had believed humanity was weak, fragile, and yet, time and time again, humanity had endured. Not just endured, triumphed. "They'll never see it coming," Aiden murmured under his breath. "What's that?" Elara asked, glancing over. Aiden shook his head, the barest hint of a smile crossing his face. "Nothing. Just a reminder that they've made a mistake." Elara studied him for a moment, the tension between them still present, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes. She didn't need to say it, but Aiden knew she felt it too. The Council had thrown down the gauntlet, and humanity was about to pick it up. As the ship emerged from the jump, the stars snapping back into place around them, Aiden's gaze sharpened. The Council's fleet was already there, waiting in formation, their ships gleaming with the polished perfection of centuries of superiority. But Aiden wasn't concerned with their ships. His mind was on what they couldn't see. The Resolute hung in space, the stars motionless outside its thick hull, their light refracted slightly by the ship's shielding systems. In the command room, Aiden stood alone, bathed in the pale glow of the control panels and holographic displays that surrounded him. His face remained calm, as always, but the weight of what was about to unfold pressed heavily against his thoughts. He tapped a sequence into the console before him, and the room shifted subtly. The main display dimmed, and a new image flickered into view. Before him materialized a map of space, a vast, intricate web of star systems and sectors, each glowing faintly as it marked the known territories of the galactic powers. But his attention was drawn to the invisible. He keyed in a secondary command, and from the depths of the map, a fleet began to emerge slowly, deliberately, like a predator surfacing from deep waters. Ship by ship, they revealed themselves on the map. Dozens of vessels, each one unlike the sleek, gleaming designs of the Galactic Council's fleet. They were darker, more angular, with a deliberate ruggedness to their shapes. These were ships built not for display, but for survival, for war. The hidden fleet of Earth. Aiden leaned forward slightly, watching as the ships assumed their positions in the distant reaches of space. No other civilization had seen this fleet. No council member had glimpsed its design. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity's forces were still modest, limited by the technology they had been allowed to develop. This fleet told a different story. The display zoomed in, focusing on one of the larger vessels, a massive dreadnought, the Dauntless. Its armor plating, forged from a composite material humanity had developed in secret, shimmered faintly in the display. The ship was bristling with weaponry, but Aiden knew that its true power lay beneath the surface. This fleet was more than the sum of its parts. Every piece of technology, every decision in its design, was meant to challenge the very laws the Council had built their superiority on. The galaxy believed it understood power. They measured it in ship counts, in energy output, in the size of their armies. But humanity had never played by the galaxy's rules. They had always adapted, always found ways to turn the impossible into an advantage. This fleet hidden from the galaxy's view was proof of that. Aiden's gaze hardened as he studied the holographic fleet. It had taken years to construct, years of secrecy, misdirection, and patience. The Council would never understand what it had taken to build this, to gather the resources, the minds, and the willpower. To them, humanity was still the same fledgling species they had discovered, fragile and inexperienced. They had no idea what was coming. But as Aiden stared at the ships, he felt the familiar unease stirring within him. It was a fleet born out of necessity, a response to the galaxy's arrogance and its refusal to acknowledge humanity's potential. It was powerful, yes, but power alone wasn't enough. Unleashing this fleet too soon, revealing it to the galaxy, would ignite a war that humanity couldn't afford to fight, not yet. He exhaled quietly, his fingers resting lightly on the console. The door behind him slid open with a soft hiss. Elara stepped in, her movements sharp and deliberate. She had been waiting for this moment, for Aiden to show her what lay beyond the surface, and now that she saw it, her eyes widened, if only for a second. "So this is it," she said, her voice steady, but there was a tension beneath her words. "This is what we've been hiding." Aiden didn't turn to face her immediately. "This is part of it." "Part of it?" Elara repeated, stepping closer to the display. "Aiden, this fleet. It's more than anything we've shown the Council. Why are we still playing their game? Why not reveal this, show them what we're capable of?" Aiden finally turned, meeting her gaze. "Because if we reveal it now, we lose." Elara's frustration was palpable. "Lose? You think this fleet can't stand up to them?" "It's not about whether we can stand up to them," Aiden said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about timing. If we show our hand now, the Council will respond with overwhelming force. They control the narrative. They'll spin this as an act of aggression, an excuse to justify a full-scale war. And right now, we don't have the resources or the alliances to survive that." Elara crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "So we're supposed to keep hiding, keep pretending we're weaker than we are." "For now," Aiden said, "we need to be patient." "Patient?" Elara's voice rose slightly, her frustration spilling over. "We've been patient for years. We've been waiting for the galaxy to take us seriously, and all they've done is look down on us. This fleet is our chance to change that." Aiden's gaze didn't waver. "And if we act too soon, it'll be our last chance." Elara paced in front of the display, the ships floating silently in the air before her. She knew Aiden was right, at least logically. The Council would not take kindly to any display of human strength, especially one that challenged their view of the galaxy. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. She turned back to face him, her frustration evident. "I don't understand how you can be so calm about this. Every day we wait is another day the Council thinks they're untouchable. Another day they mock us, dismiss us." Aiden studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you remember what happened at the First Contact Summit?" Elara frowned. "Of course I do. It was a disaster. The Council made a mockery of us, and we walked away with nothing. They made a mockery of us because we walked in thinking we had to prove ourselves," Aiden said, his voice quiet but firm. "We thought we had to show them that we were worthy of respect, that we belonged. And because of that, they saw us as desperate, weak." Elara opened her mouth to respond, but Aiden continued before she could. "Power isn't about showing off what you have," he said. "It's about knowing when to use it. If we reveal this fleet now, we're giving them exactly what they want, a reason to strike. But if we hold back, if we wait for the right moment, we can turn this fleet into something they can't ignore." Elara shook her head, her frustration still simmering. "And when will that moment come? When they've pushed us to the edge? When we have no choice but to fight?" Aiden's gaze was steady. "When they least expect it." The room fell into a tense silence. Elara stood with her arms crossed, her eyes focused on the holographic ships, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. She had never been good at waiting, at playing the long game. Her instincts had always driven her to act, to fight back against the injustice and arrogance that seemed to define the galaxy's view of humanity. But Aiden was different. He had always been the strategist, the one who saw the larger picture, even when it meant holding back. And that was the source of the tension between them. Aiden's calm, measured approach clashed with Elara's fiery nature. She wanted to strike now, to prove to the galaxy that humanity wasn't to be underestimated. But Aiden's restraint was a constant reminder of the delicate balance they had to maintain. She finally exhaled, turning to face him fully. "So what do we do now? Just wait for the council to finish their demonstration and hope they don't see through us?" Aiden shook his head. "No, we're not just waiting, we're preparing." Elara raised an eyebrow. "Preparing for what?" "For the moment when they realize their mistake," Aiden said. "And by then, it'll be too late for them to do anything about it." Elara stared at him, her frustration slowly giving way to a reluctant understanding. She didn't like the waiting, the secrecy, the constant balancing act. But Aiden was right. They couldn't afford to show their hand too soon. Not yet. But when the time came, when the council finally realized what humanity was capable of, Elara knew they wouldn't be able to ignore them any longer. And that moment was approaching faster than any of them could predict. Elara left the command room, her thoughts swirling. Aiden's words hung in the air like an unfinished argument. The corridors of the Resolute were quiet, but not empty. Personnel moved with purpose, their faces etched with the same tension that had simmered in the room she had just left. It wasn't just the Council's challenge that weighed on them, it was the knowledge that humanity's future hung on decisions made behind closed doors. She brushed past the bustling officers, her mind far from the daily routines of the ship. She had seen the fleet, felt its power in every line of the ship's construction. The fire that had burned within her in Aiden's presence now simmered into a low, persistent frustration. She trusted Aiden, perhaps more than anyone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their window of opportunity was closing with each passing day. Aiden remained in the command room, staring at the flickering image of the fleet. He had shut down the room's communications, leaving himself in solitude. His mind was spinning with calculations, each one weighed against a set of unknowns. Could he really keep this hidden for much longer? Could they hold out until the moment was right? The pressure of leadership weighed heavily on him. The burden of secrecy was becoming harder to bear. He understood the stakes better than anyone, yet even he felt the creeping doubt that had taken hold of Elara. He had held this fleet in reserve for years, but every moment they delayed revealing it was a gamble. If their enemies discovered it before they were ready, the consequences would be catastrophic. He reached out and tapped another sequence into the console. The holographic display shifted, zooming in on the Dauntless once again. It had taken the best of Earth's minds to create that ship, and the others in the hidden fleet. They had achieved technological feats that no alien species had even considered. The ship's armor alone, developed under layers of secrecy, was nearly impervious to the energy weapons the Galactic Council relied upon. Its engines designed with a mix of human ingenuity and some borrowed alien tech allowed it to maneuver in ways the rest of the galaxy couldn't comprehend. But the fleet wasn't invincible. Aiden knew that. For all their advancements, they were still a single species surrounded by civilizations that had millennia of experience navigating the galactic political landscape. And while Earth had adapted to challenges, the Council wasn't an enemy they could easily outmaneuver. He shut the display down with a final command. The room fell into darkness, illuminated only by the soft hum of the ship's systems. Aiden knew the coming days would test his resolve in ways that went beyond the fleet's capabilities. It was the weight of the decision when and how to use this secret that kept him awake at night. The door hissed open, and Captain Elara stepped in, her expression serious. "Sir, the Council's representatives are preparing to broadcast their fleet demonstration in 3 hours. They've invited all major powers to witness it." Aiden nodded, unsurprised. "They want to make it a spectacle." "Yes, sir," Elara replied, her tone stiff. "What do you plan to do?" Aiden remained quiet for a moment. He knew that the Council's show of force wasn't just about the demonstration. It was a calculated move, one designed to humiliate Earth. But it was also a distraction, a way to keep their attention on the Council's power, rather than the hidden weaknesses behind their gleaming fleets. "Have our people ready for a public response," Aiden said finally. "We won't give them what they want." Let them parade their ships, let them boast. But we'll keep our cards close to our chest. Captain Lai nodded, though Aiden could sense her unease. She had served with him long enough to know that his calm demeanor often masked the complexity of the situations they faced. But, like Elara, she was struggling to understand why they continued to hold back. Understood, sir. I'll ensure everything is prepared. As she turned to leave, Aiden spoke again. And Captain, make sure our intelligence teams are keeping a close eye on the Council's movements. If they're planning something more than a show, I want to know about it. Yes, sir. Lai left the room, the door sliding shut behind her. The hours passed in a tense quiet aboard the Resolute. Elara found herself unable to focus, wandering through the ship's corridors aimlessly. The weight of inaction pressed on her. It was unlike her to remain idle in the face of adversity. She had always been a woman of action, and yet here she was, waiting for the Council to make its move, waiting for Aiden to decide the right moment to strike. She found herself in one of the observation decks, the expanse of space laid out before her. The stars seemed closer here, more vibrant against the black canvas of space. She stared at them, trying to clear her mind, but her thoughts kept returning to the same point: humanity's place in the galaxy. Was this what they had fought so hard for? To hide their strength, to bide their time while the galaxy sneered at them? Her hand tightened around the railing in front of her. She thought of Earth, the place they called home, the place that the Council refused to acknowledge as a true power. They were seen as upstarts, as a species that had climbed too far too fast. But they had survived worse. They had risen from wars that had torn their planet apart, faced challenges that should have broken them, and still they had endured. So what now? Were they holding back? She didn't notice Aiden's presence until he was standing beside her, his gaze fixed on the stars. "You're restless," he said quietly. Elara didn't answer at first. She didn't need to. Aiden knew her too well. Finally, she spoke. "We have the fleet, Aiden. We have the technology, the strength. Why are we still playing their game?" Aiden leaned against the railing, his face calm, but his eyes reflecting the weight of his thoughts. "Because we're not ready for the consequences of revealing that strength. The moment we show them what we've built, we become a threat. Right now, we're a nuisance and annoyance that they think they can control. The minute we step out of that role, the entire galaxy will come down on us. And you think we're not strong enough to handle that?" Aiden exhaled, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air of the observation deck. "It's not just about strength, Elara. It's about alliances, about timing. We need to be more than just strong, we need to be untouchable." She frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "And when will that be? When we've lost the respect we've fought for? When the Council has stripped us of any chance to stand on equal footing?" Aiden turned to face her, his expression serious. "The Council doesn't respect strength. They respect control. If we show our hand too early, they'll find a way to control us, to isolate us. We have to be patient." Elara shook her head, stepping away from the railing. "I just don't know how much longer we can afford to be patient. Every day we wait, they push us further down." Aiden's gaze didn't waver. "I know it's hard, but if we reveal the fleet now, we lose everything we've built. We have to trust the plan." She wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down she knew Aiden was right. It didn't make it any easier. She gave him a long look before turning away, walking out of the observation deck without another word. Aiden remained behind, staring out into the void. His mind raced with the possibilities, the risks, the inevitable confrontation that loomed on the horizon. They were playing a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could mean the end of everything they had fought for. But he couldn't let that fear drive him. He couldn't let the urgency that Elara felt push him into making a move too soon. Timing was everything, and as much as it pained him to hold back, he knew that the moment would come. The Council was overconfident, blinded by their arrogance. They would slip, and when they did, humanity would be ready. The stars outside continued to burn, distant and indifferent to the struggles unfolding in the quiet halls of the Resolute. But Aiden's thoughts were not on the stars. His mind was focused on the future, on the hidden fleet that lay in wait, and on the moment when the galaxy would finally understand the full measure of humanity's strength. The soft hum of the Resolute's engines was the only sound that accompanied Aiden as he sat in his private quarters. The space around him was sparse, deliberately so. A single desk, a small viewport, and the faint glow of a terminal were all that filled the room. It was a quiet place, a refuge from the constant stream of decisions and calculations that came with command. Here, for a moment, he could find clarity, away from the pressure of leadership, away from the mounting impatience that Elara had voiced. A deep breath. He closed his eyes and let his mind wander through the stillness, allowing his thoughts to flow freely. The Council's test loomed on the horizon, and it would not be kind. They had engineered this situation with precision, expecting humanity to fail. The equipment they provided had been outdated, the training simulations filled with deliberate flaws. It was nothing less than a trap, one designed to reinforce the galaxy's low regard for Earth and its people. And yet, Aiden remained calm. There was no fear, no anxiety, just the cool calculation of a man who knew the stakes, but refused to let them dictate his actions. He had spent hours reviewing the test parameters, going over every line of code, every instruction. It was designed to push them into a corner, a simulation that would expose humanity's perceived weaknesses while giving the Council ample reason to tighten their grip. But he had also seen the gaps in their plan. The Council's arrogance had left subtle oversights, places where their traps could be turned against them. Aiden had mapped out every possibility, every scenario. It was not a matter of winning. It was a matter of survival. And that was what Aiden excelled at, finding the path that others missed, the opening that others overlooked. The door to his quarters slid open with a soft hiss, and Elara stepped in. She didn't need to ask permission to enter anymore. The bond between them went beyond protocol, though it was growing more strained with each passing day. He could sense the tension in her movements, the way her eyes never fully met his, the quiet simmer of frustration that had become a constant presence in her voice. "We're ready," she said, her tone clipped. Aiden opened his eyes, leaning back slightly in his chair. He studied her for a moment, noting the way she stood, arms crossed, her stance rigid. She was like a spring wound too tight, ready to snap at any moment. "Elara," he said quietly, "you need to clear your mind before we go into this." She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Clear my mind? Aiden, they're setting us up to fail. You know that as well as I do. And you're just sitting here, waiting for it to happen. How can you be so calm?" Aiden stood slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. "Because losing my calm won't change the outcome. What we need now is focus, precision. The Council expects us to fail. They've designed this test to humiliate us, to remind the galaxy that humanity is a second-rate power. But that's why we need to be smarter than them. We survive, Elara. That's the goal." Her eyes flashed with frustration, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Survive? Is that really what we've come to? We have the strength to show them what we're capable of, and instead, we're playing their game, letting them push us into a corner. Why are we still holding back?" Aiden met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Because the time isn't right. You know as well as I do that if we reveal the fleet now, it won't just be the Council we're fighting. The entire galaxy will see us as a threat, and they'll unite against us. We can't win that war, not yet." Elara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. She knew Aiden's logic was sound, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. She turned, heading for the door, her voice colder than before. "I'll be on the bridge." Aiden watched her go, his face betraying no emotion. He knew this tension between them would only grow with time, but he also knew that patience was their greatest weapon. He couldn't afford to rush, no matter how much pressure mounted from those around him. The bridge of the Resolute was quiet, the crew operating with a disciplined efficiency that had become their hallmark. Every officer knew what was at stake, though none of them voiced it aloud. Elara stood at the front, staring at the vast emptiness of space through the viewport, her mind racing with unspoken thoughts. The Council's fleet hung in the distance, their ships arranged in a loose formation, waiting for the signal to begin. Aiden entered the bridge, moving to stand beside Elara. His presence was steady, grounding, but it did little to soothe the storm brewing inside her. "Status?" he asked, his voice calm as ever. Captain Lai stepped forward. "We've completed all pre-mission checks. The simulation is ready to begin on your command." Aiden nodded, taking in the sight of the Council's ships. They were massive, gleaming with the polished arrogance of a fleet that had never known true defeat. But Aiden saw beyond the grandeur. He saw the weaknesses in their formation, the overconfidence in their maneuvers. They believed this would be an easy victory, a simple exercise in humiliation. "Begin the simulation," Aiden ordered, his tone as calm as if they were engaging in a routine drill. The screens on the bridge flickered to life, displaying a series of holographic markers that represented the simulated combat scenario. The Council's ships moved into position, their weapon systems powering up, while the Resolute and her accompanying vessels were restricted by the outdated equipment provided by the Council. Elara's eyes narrowed as she watched the scenario unfold. It was clear from the outset that the odds were heavily stacked against them. The Council's ships moved with precision, their technology far superior to the deliberately sabotaged systems the humans had been given. The gap between the two forces was staggering. "They've crippled us from the start," Elara muttered under her breath, her frustration palpable. Aiden remained composed, his eyes scanning the data streaming across the displays. "It's not about winning, Elara. It's about surviving. We need to show them that we can adapt, even under these conditions." The Council's fleet began their assault, their ships launching waves of simulated energy blast toward the human vessels. The Resolute and the others responded as best they could, but their systems were sluggish, unresponsive. Every maneuver was a struggle, every attempt to counter the attack hampered by the faulty equipment. Elara clenched her fists, her jaw tight as she watched the human ships falter. "This is a joke. They're toying with us." Aiden's voice remained calm, though there was a steely edge to it. "Focus on the gaps. They've left themselves vulnerable in their overconfidence." He issued a series of rapid commands, directing the fleet with precision. Despite the limitations of their equipment, Aiden found openings in the Council's formation, exploiting their weaknesses with surgical accuracy. The human ships, though struggling, managed to evade the brunt of the assault, weaving through the barrage with a combination of luck and Aiden's strategic brilliance. But it wasn't enough to turn the tide. The Council ships pressed the advantage, their superior technology overwhelming the human fleet at every turn. The simulation was designed to highlight humanity's inadequacies, and it was succeeding. The gap between the two forces was undeniable. Elara's frustration boiled over as she watched another human ship take a simulated hit, its systems going offline. She turned to Aiden, her voice low but sharp. "This is what we're doing, scraping by on scraps, letting them humiliate us like this?" Aiden didn't respond immediately, his focus still on the battle unfolding before them. He issued another command, directing a damaged ship to fall back and regroup. Only then did he turn to face her, his expression unreadable. "We're not here to win, Elara. We're here to survive. If we push too hard, if we try to show them what we're really capable of, we risk everything. You know that." Her eyes blazed with anger. "And what about the respect we're losing every time we back down? The Council sees us as weak because we keep playing their game. We have the power to show them what we're made of, but you're holding us back." Aiden's gaze remained steady, though there was a tension beneath his calm exterior. "This isn't about respect. It's about survival. If we reveal the fleet now, if we show them our true strength, the entire galaxy will unite against us. We can't win that fight, Elara. Not yet." Elara's hands tightened into fists, her frustration reaching its breaking point. She turned away from him, staring out at the simulation with a mix of anger and helplessness. The Council's ships continued their assault, their superiority undeniable. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Aiden's strategy had kept the human fleet from complete destruction. They were battered, but they survived. The simulation came to an end with a final barrage from the Council's ships, their victory assured. The human fleet, though intact, had performed poorly, their inadequacies laid bare for all to see. The bridge was silent as the simulation ended. The crew, though disciplined, couldn't hide the disappointment in their faces. They had expected this outcome, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Aiden stood at the center of it all, his expression calm, unreadable. He turned to face the crew, his voice steady as he addressed them. "We survived. That's what matters." Elara shot him a glance, her frustration still simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to say more, to challenge him, but she held her tongue. Now wasn't the time. As the crew began to disperse, Aiden turned to Elara, his voice quiet. "I know you're angry, Elara, but trust me, this is the only way. We have to be patient." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes locked on the viewport. Finally, she spoke, her voice laced with frustration and resignation. "I just hope you're right, Aiden, because I'm not sure how much longer we can keep playing this game." The ship hummed softly, a near-constant sound that had become background noise over the weeks, like the distant memory of a storm long past. Aiden stood alone at the viewport, his hands clasped behind his back, the endless void of stars stretching before him. From this vantage, it was easy to imagine that nothing existed beyond the shimmering lights, just the quiet, cold expanse of space. But Aiden knew better. In the stillness of the moment, he reflected on the burden he carried. The decision to keep their fleet hidden, tucked away in the shadow of distant moons and asteroid belts, weighed heavily on him. He wondered how much longer they could play this game of concealment, of waiting for the right moment, without losing themselves in the process. Humanity's place in the universe felt more precarious with each passing day. The others didn't see it. Not yet. They were too focused on the immediate threats, the negotiations, the calculations of survival. But Aiden felt something deeper at play, a thread pulling on the fabric of reality, on the essence of existence itself. It was a feeling he couldn't quite shake, as if they were being watched by something far greater than they could understand. His thoughts drifted to the stories he'd heard, whispered among the elder race's theories and legends of an ancient, unseen force that had existed long before the galaxy's current power players. The Silent Watchers, they were called, a name that echoed in the forgotten corners of history, rarely spoken aloud, and even less understood. No one had ever seen them, and yet their presence was felt, subtle and elusive, like a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Were they real, or just a tale woven to explain the inexplicable, a fable to remind the powerful that they, too, could be vulnerable? Aiden wasn't sure, but he couldn't dismiss the notion entirely. Not anymore. The galaxy was full of mysteries. The deeper they ventured into space, the more they uncovered, and the more they realized how little they truly knew. It was easy to get lost in the grandeur of it all, to believe that humanity was on the cusp of something greater. But with that realization came fear of what power could do to them, of what it had already done to so many civilizations before. He sighed, his breath fogging the glass for a moment before it dissipated. Humanity had always been resilient, adaptable, but that didn't make them immune to the corrupting influence of power. Aiden had seen it before, in small ways, creeping into the minds of leaders, generals, and even his own crew. It started subtly, a desire for control, for certainty in an uncertain universe. But it grew, fed by the belief that they could shape destiny itself. The temptation to reveal their fleet was strong. Elara, especially, had been pushing for it, frustrated by the waiting, the uncertainty. She saw it as a move of strength, a way to remind their enemies and their allies that humanity was not to be underestimated. But Aiden hesitated. He didn't fear their enemies. He feared what it would do to them. To be seen as the galaxy's next great power was to invite a transformation in themselves, one that might strip away the very things that made them human. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if they were ready, or if they ever would be. The door slid open behind him, and Aiden didn't need to turn to know who it was. He could feel Elara's presence, the simmering tension in her footsteps as she approached. "You're thinking again," she said, her voice soft but edged with impatience. Aiden gave a small smile, though his gaze never left the stars. "A dangerous habit, I know." She stood beside him, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the same expanse. "You can't sit on this forever, Aiden. We're running out of time. Every day we wait, we lose ground." "I know." His voice was quiet, contemplative. "But revealing the fleet too soon could cost us everything. We need to be sure." "Sure of what?" Elara's tone sharpened. "That we're ready? We've been ready for years. The longer we stay hidden, the more they think we're weak. We can't afford that perception." Aiden finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about appearances, Elara. It's about what kind of future we want to create." Elara frowned, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" Aiden took a breath, his gaze steady. "Power changes people. It changes civilizations. We've seen it before countless times. Empires rise, convinced they're different, that they'll be better than those who came before. But in the end, they all fall. They become the very thing they fought against." "You think we'll become like them?" Elara asked, incredulous. "That's not who we are, Aiden. We're fighting for survival, not domination." "Maybe now," Aiden said, his voice heavy with thought. "But once we reveal the fleet, everything changes. We won't just be fighting for survival anymore. We'll be fighting to maintain our position, to hold on to the power we've gained, and that's when the real danger begins." Elara fell silent, her frustration giving way to contemplation. She hadn't considered it that way. To her, the fleet was a means of protection, a shield against the threats that loomed over them. But Aiden was right. Power had a way of distorting even the best intentions. "So, what then?" she asked after a long pause. "We just keep hiding, hoping no one notices us?" "No," Aiden said, his tone resolute. "We wait for the right moment. When we're ready, when we know we can use that power without losing ourselves." Elara exhaled, her breath shaky. She hated the waiting, the uncertainty. But she also trusted Aiden. He had led them this far, and despite her doubts, she couldn't deny the wisdom in his words. Still, a question lingered at the edge of her mind, one she couldn't shake. "And what if we're never ready?" Aiden's gaze returned to the stars, his expression distant. "Then maybe that's the answer." Elara stared at him, searching his face for some hint of reassurance, but found none. She turned away, frustration bubbling beneath the surface once more. "I hope you know what you're doing, Aiden." As she walked away, Aiden's thoughts returned to the silent watchers. He couldn't prove they existed, but he felt their gaze, their quiet observation, like a weight on his soul. Perhaps they, too, had once grappled with the same questions, the same fear of what power might do. And perhaps they had found the answers he was still searching for. For now, all Aiden could do was watch and wait. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with a subdued tension, the kind that settled deep in the bones and lingered like a storm on the horizon. Aiden had been here too many times to count, and yet each visit felt heavier than the last. He could feel the collective gaze of the council members upon him, each one a representative of the most powerful species in the galaxy, each one growing more suspicious by the day. The council had always been a delicate dance. Humanity was tolerated, perhaps even admired in certain circles, but never trusted. And now, after the failed test and the growing rumors of hidden fleets, the whispers had turned into open questions. The council was no longer content with polite smiles and vague assurances. They wanted answers. Aiden sat at his usual seat, his posture calm and collected, but inside, his mind churned with 1,000 thoughts. To his left sat Elara, her presence a steady force, though he could sense the unease in her as well. The room was vast, filled with towering pillars and cold, reflective surfaces that distorted the figures of the council members, making them appear larger, more imposing. It was designed to remind everyone who entered of their place, and Aiden could feel the weight of that reminder pressing down on him now. "The human delegation has arrived," the voice of the council chair, an ancient being whose face seemed carved from stone, echoed through the chamber. Aiden nodded respectfully, keeping his expression neutral. He glanced at Elara, who returned the look, her eyes sharp with alertness. They both knew this meeting would be different. The council was growing impatient, and their patience, when stretched too thin, often snapped in dangerous ways. The chair leaned forward slightly, its many eyes narrowing in on Aiden. There have been concerns raised among the council regarding humanity's recent activities. Aiden raised an eyebrow, keeping his voice measured. Concerns, Chair. The chair's gaze shifted slightly, a ripple of tension running through the assembly. Your species has shown remarkable resilience in the face of adversity, which is admirable. However, certain reports suggest that there are operations underway that the Council has not been informed of. We value transparency, Ambassador Aiden. The implication was clear. They knew something, or at least suspected it. How much, Aiden couldn't be sure. He had spent years crafting humanity's image as a resourceful yet relatively harmless species playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true capabilities. But it seemed the Council was no longer content to wait. We have always been transparent with the Council, Aiden replied, his voice steady, and we continue to adhere to all regulations and protocols set forth by this body. The chair's lips curled slightly, a gesture that Aiden knew all too well. And yet, there are rumors of secret fleets, hidden armaments, operations that seem beyond what a species of your standing should be capable of. A subtle shift rippled through the room, a low murmur passing between the council members. Aiden met their eyes, one by one, assessing the mood. Suspicion, distrust, they were growing wary, and that made them dangerous. We have nothing to hide, Aiden said evenly. Our technology and capabilities are well within the bounds of what is permitted by the Council. If there are concerns, we are more than willing to address them. The chair's gaze lingered on Aiden for a long moment, before finally leaning back. Very well, but understand this, the Council does not take kindly to deception. We expect full cooperation in all matters moving forward. Aiden inclined his head. Of course, Chair. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. What once had been cautious diplomacy was now laced with overt suspicion. The Council was watching, waiting for a misstep, and Aiden knew they could not afford one. Not now. As the session drew to a close, Aiden and Elara exchanged few words. The silence between them was telling enough. Both knew the weight of what had just transpired. Later, in the relative privacy of their ship's command room, Elara finally broke the silence. They know. Aiden, seated at the command console, didn't immediately respond. He was lost in thought, replaying every word, every glance from the council members. Finally, he nodded. They suspect, at least, but we've kept everything under tight control. They don't have proof. Elara paced the length of the room, her frustration barely contained. How long do you think that will last? You saw the way they looked at us. They're just waiting for an excuse to come down on us with everything they have. Aiden turned in his chair, facing her. I know, but we can't afford to be reckless now. If we reveal the fleet too soon, we'll be inviting open conflict. We're not ready for that. Elara stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto his. And what if we never are? You've been saying the same thing for months, Aiden. Always waiting, always calculating. At some point, we have to act. Aiden's expression softened. He could see the toll this was taking on her. Elara had always been the one to push forward, to take risks when necessary. It was part of what made her an exceptional leader. But in this situation, that same drive could lead them into disaster. I understand your frustration, he said carefully. But this isn't just about us. It's about the survival of our entire species. If we rush into this, we could lose everything. Elara shook her head, her voice lowering to a more measured tone. It's not just about survival, Aiden. It's about more than that. Humanity deserves a place in the galaxy, a place of respect. Right now, we're just clinging to the edges, pretending to be something we're not. Aiden sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew she was right, at least in part. But he also knew the risks of revealing their full power before they were ready. The galaxy was a brutal, unforgiving place. Strength alone wasn't enough to survive, it had to be wielded wisely. "The Council is scared," he said after a long pause. "Not just of us, but of what we represent. They've seen species rise before, and they know what happens when someone new disrupts the balance. If we push too hard, they'll see us as a threat, and threats are dealt with." Elara sat down across from him, her expression softening. "So what do we do?" Aiden looked out the viewport, the stars stretching endlessly before them. "We wait, we plan, and we make sure that when the time comes, we're ready." Elara frowned, but didn't argue. She knew Aiden too well, he wouldn't be swayed easily. And as much as she hated to admit it, there was wisdom in his caution. But that didn't make the waiting any easier. Meanwhile, far beyond the human fleet, in the dark reaches of space, a small, covert ship slipped unnoticed through the black void. Its hull was coated in a material that absorbed light and energy, rendering it nearly invisible to any sensors. Inside, a group of alien operatives worked silently, their eyes fixed on the displays before them. The mission was simple: gather intelligence on humanity. The Council wanted to know what the humans were hiding, and this team had been sent to find out. They were among the best trained in espionage, stealth, and infiltration, and they had their sights set on humanity's secret operations. The lead operative, a member of the highly skilled and enigmatic Rill species, stared at the screen with unblinking eyes. They had been tracking human movements for weeks now, observing the fleet's maneuvers, studying their tactics, but so far they had found nothing conclusive. "Anything unusual?" the operative asked, their voice a low, mechanical rasp. One of the analysts shook their head. "Nothing yet. Their movements are standard, within the expected parameters." The operative frowned, tapping a clawed finger against the console. "They're hiding something. We just have to find it." The ship continued its silent observation, moving closer to the human fleet with each passing hour. The operatives knew time was against them soon. The humans would notice their presence. But they were prepared. They had to be. For the Council had made one thing clear: failure was not an option. Back aboard the human flagship, Aiden stood once again at the viewport, unaware of the eyes watching from afar. The quiet hum of the command deck lingered as Aiden remained motionless by the viewport, his gaze fixed on the stars. The weight of the Council's suspicion hung over him like an invisible chain, each link forged by the growing tension between humanity and the other species of the galaxy. It wasn't the first time Aiden had felt the world pressing in on him, but today it felt different. The Council was watching too closely now. Any false step could be the spark that ignited a war humanity wasn't prepared to fight. Elara's voice broke the silence. "You know they'll send someone." Aiden turned slightly, meeting her eyes. "They already have. It's just a matter of time before they make their move." Elara stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "And when they do, what's the plan?" For a moment, Aiden considered his response. He knew Elara was right. The Council would push harder, test their boundaries, and probe for weaknesses. The spy ship currently tailing them was just the beginning. They would send more. They would come closer. They would force humanity's hand. "We're not taking any action until we have proof," Aiden finally said. "We can't afford to give them a reason to strike first. If we move prematurely, we'll confirm their suspicions." Elara's expression softened, but a trace of frustration lingered. "And what happens when they catch us off guard? We both know they'll escalate the moment they think they have the upper hand. Waiting might be the safer option now, but what happens when we're the ones backed into a corner?" Aiden studied her, noticing the weight of responsibility that had started to settle in her posture. She wasn't reckless, despite her earlier frustrations, but her desire to act stemmed from a deeper concern, a fear that their careful strategies might be outpaced by the Council's growing aggression. He understood that fear. It gnawed at him as well. "We won't let them corner us," Aiden said softly. "But we can't afford to let fear dictate our actions either. That's what they're counting on, that we'll panic and reveal our cards before we're ready. Elara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what if that moment never comes? What if waiting just lets them strengthen their hold on us? Aiden didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the vastness beyond the ship, where humanity's hidden strength still remained shrouded in secrecy. The silent, unseen fleet, powerful and poised, was a constant reminder of the balance they had to maintain. For now, the Council remained ignorant of its existence, but that wouldn't last forever. They don't know everything, Aiden said quietly, almost to himself. They think we're weak, struggling to survive on the edges of the galaxy. They don't see the bigger picture. And when they do, Elara pressed. Aiden exhaled, turning back to face her fully. When they do, we'll be ready, but not a moment before. The words hung between them, a fragile truce that neither fully accepted nor rejected. Elara's eyes flickered with unspoken thoughts, but she didn't push further. Aiden knew she understood the stakes as well as he did. She was a leader in her own right, and despite their differences, he trusted her instincts. As if on cue, the comm system beeped, breaking the tense silence. Aiden glanced at the console, his hand hovering over the controls for a brief second before he activated the line. "Commander Aiden," came the voice of one of the junior officers, "we've detected a small vessel in our vicinity. It's not broadcasting any identification signals." Aiden's eyes narrowed. He had expected this sooner or later, but the timing still unsettled him. How close? Approximately 150,000 kilometers off our port side. It's running dark, no energy emissions or communications detected. Elara's expression shifted, a subtle look of vindication crossing her face. "They're here." Aiden nodded, his mind already racing through possibilities. The Council had sent a reconnaissance ship, likely cloaked or running on low power to avoid detection. It wasn't an attack, at least not yet, but it was a clear sign that the Council was no longer content to observe from a distance. "Bring the fleet to alert," Aiden ordered calmly. "But maintain our current course and speed. We're not engaging unless provoked." The officer acknowledged the command, and the comm fell silent once more. Elara stepped closer, her voice lowering. "If they're spying on us, they're not here for a friendly chat. We need to act before they gather anything useful." Aiden shook his head. "We can't risk tipping them off that we know they're there. If we engage now, it'll only confirm their suspicions. We need to stay ahead of them, let them think they're still hidden. And if they decide to make the first move, we'll be ready." Aiden's tone was firm, but his thoughts were racing. They had prepared for this moment for years, anticipating every possible scenario. But now that the Council's covert force was here, everything felt more immediate, more dangerous. The minutes dragged on, a heavy tension filling the air as the fleet continued its slow, steady course through space. The presence of the spy vessel was a constant weight in the back of Aiden's mind, but he knew that moving too soon would be disastrous. They had to let the Council believe they were still ignorant, that humanity was still playing by the Council's rules. It was a delicate balance. One wrong move, and the fragile peace they had maintained for so long would shatter. Elara's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're playing a dangerous game, Aiden." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's the only game we can play right now. If we make the wrong move, they'll use it against us. But if we wait, we might find the opening we need." Elara crossed her arms, her frustration evident. "And how long are we supposed to wait? Until they gather enough information to cripple us?" "They won't get that far," Aiden said, though he wasn't entirely sure of that. "We've prepared for this." The tension between them simmered, but before either could say more, the comm beeped again. "Commander," the officer's voice crackled through the line, "we've detected a brief energy spike from the unidentified vessel. It appears they may have activated some kind of scanning system." Aiden's jaw tightened. The spies were getting bolder. "Shut down all non-essential systems," Aiden ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Reduce our energy signature as much as possible. If they're scanning us, We'll give them nothing to see. Elara watched him, her eyes narrowing. They're going to push further. You know that. Aiden nodded. Let them. We'll be ready when they do. Far beyond the view of humanity's fleet, the cloaked alien vessel drifted silently in space. Inside, the operatives monitored their systems carefully, watching for any sign that the humans had detected their presence. The lead operative leaned forward, studying the readouts on the screen. We're picking up minimal energy emissions. They've shut down most of their systems. The analyst beside them frowned. That's unusual. Most fleets wouldn't drop their energy signature without a reason. The operative's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into their voice. They know we're here. The analyst hesitated. But there's no indication that they've detected us. No movement, no comms chatter. They're too quiet, the operative interrupted, their voice low. Humans may be primitive, but they're not stupid. They're onto us. The silence in the ship was palpable as the operatives exchanged uneasy glances. The mission had been simple: observe, gather information, and report back to the Council. But now, it seemed the humans were one step ahead of them. What do we do? The analyst asked quietly. The lead operative's gaze flickered toward the screen, where the human fleet continued its steady course through space. We wait. If they make a move, we'll be ready. The distant alarms echoed through the command deck, sharp and unrelenting. Aiden stood at the center, his eyes locked on the tactical screen before him. The red blips that marked the alien faction ships crept closer to the human colony, their movements precise and coordinated. It wasn't the Galactic Council this time. No, this was something else, something more dangerous. Rogue elements, driven by their own agendas, had chosen to strike at humanity's most vulnerable point. A human colony on the outer edge of explored space. Far enough from Earth to feel isolated, yet too critical to lose. Thousands of families called it home, unaware of the danger descending upon them. Elara stood beside him, her gaze equally fixed on the unfolding situation. She didn't speak at first, but the tension in her posture betrayed her thoughts. Finally, she turned to Aiden, her voice low but firm. We need to move the fleet. Aiden remained silent, his mind running through every possible outcome. Moving the hidden fleet, humanity's ace in the hole, was no simple decision. Their power remained concealed for a reason. If they revealed their hand too soon, the entire balance of the galaxy would shift. The Council would learn the truth, and the fragile peace they had maintained for so long would shatter. But if they did nothing, the colony would be decimated. Thousands would die. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every choice carried consequences. Every action created ripples that spread far beyond the immediate moment. I understand the stakes, Aiden said quietly. But if we deploy the fleet now, we lose any chance of surprise later. The Council will know we've been hiding our strength, and they'll act before we're fully prepared. Elara's eyes flashed with frustration. And what about the people on that colony? Are we just going to let them die because we're waiting for the right moment? You've always talked about strategy, Aiden, but sometimes you have to act. Her words cut deep, but Aiden didn't flinch. He knew she was right, in part. The colony's survival was paramount. He felt that as deeply as she did. But the long game required patience. He had spent years building humanity's hidden strength, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. Acting prematurely could unravel everything. We'll send the known fleet, Aiden said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of finality. We have enough forces stationed nearby to defend the colony. They'll hold off the attack long enough for us to reinforce them. Elara's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer to the tactical screen, watching as the rogue faction's ships continued their approach. And if they don't hold, what then? Aiden didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He had run every possible scenario in his mind, and none of them felt right. There were no easy answers in situations like this, only difficult choices that left a mark, no matter the outcome. Finally, he turned to one of the officers on the deck. Deploy the outer fleet. We'll divert resources from the nearest stations. Get them to the colony as soon as possible." The officer nodded and relayed the orders. Aiden watched as the known fleet ships that the Galactic Council was well aware of moved into position. They weren't the most powerful vessels in humanity's arsenal, but they would have to be enough. Elara crossed her arms, watching the screen with a critical eye. "It's a gamble, Aiden. You know that." "I know," he replied, "but it's the only one we can afford to take right now." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the weight of the decision hanging heavy between them. Aiden could feel the unspoken tension, the divide between them that had grown sharper over the past few months. Elara wanted action, decisive and immediate. She believed in the strength they had built, and she was eager to use it. Aiden, on the other hand, was more cautious. He understood the importance of timing, the need to hold back until the right moment presented itself. But how long could they afford to wait? The minutes ticked by as the human fleet engaged the rogue ships. The tactical screen showed the battle unfolding in real time, a chaotic dance of ships and energy blasts. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest as he watched. Each loss of a human ship felt like a personal blow, each explosion a reminder of the lives at stake. "They're holding," one of the officers reported. "But the rogue ships are more coordinated than expected. We're taking heavy losses." Elara shot a glance at Aiden. "We need to reinforce them." "We are," Aiden said, his voice tight, "but it'll take time." Elara shook her head, her frustration mounting. "Time we don't have." Another explosion rocked the screen, and Aiden could feel the pressure building. He had always believed in the importance of strategy in the long-term view. But now, with the lives of thousands hanging in the balance, he felt the sharp edge of doubt creeping in. Was he making the right call? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Doubt wouldn't help him now. He had made his decision, and he had to see it through. The battle raged for hours. The human fleet, though outnumbered, fought valiantly. Their ships maneuvered with precision, their tactics sharp and effective. But the rogue faction was relentless. They attacked with a ferocity that surprised even Aiden. These weren't just opportunistic pirates, they were well-organized, well-equipped, and determined to destroy the colony. Reports of losses came in steadily. Ship after ship fell under the barrage of enemy fire, their crews fighting to the last moment. The human forces were holding the line, but just barely. Aiden's eyes never left the screen. He could see the tipping point approaching. The fleet wouldn't be able to hold much longer. Reinforcements were still en route, but they might not arrive in time. Elara paced behind him, her frustration growing with each passing minute. "We're losing them, Aiden." "I know." "Then why aren't we doing more? We have the strength, we have the ships. We could end this right now if we just—" "No," Aiden interrupted, his voice firm. "If we move the hidden fleet now, we lose everything. The Council will see our hand, and they'll strike before we're ready. We can't afford that risk." "And we can't afford to let thousands of people die," Elara shot back, her voice rising. The command deck fell silent as her words hung in the air. Aiden could feel the eyes of the officers on him, waiting for his response. He could sense their unease, their doubt. They were watching their commander make a decision that could cost thousands of lives, and they weren't sure if they could trust his judgment. Aiden turned slowly to face Elara. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't weighed every option, every possibility? I know what's at stake here. But we have to think beyond this one battle. If we reveal our strength now, we lose the element of surprise, and that could cost us far more in the long run." Elara's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, her hands clenched at her sides. Aiden could see the struggle in her posture, the tension between her desire to act and her understanding of the bigger picture. "We'll hold the line," Aiden said quietly. "The reinforcements will arrive, and we'll push them back. We've prepared for this." But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the doubt creeping in. The fleet was holding, but for how long? How many more lives would be lost before the reinforcements arrived? The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. Each report of another ship lost felt like a personal failure, a reminder of the cost of his decision. The colony was still intact, but the rogue faction was closing in. The human fleet was fighting with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. "We've lost another cruiser," one of the officers reported. "The enemy is breaching our perimeter." Aiden's jaw tightened. They were running out of time. "Elara," he said, his voice low, "prepare the hidden fleet. If we don't get word of the reinforcements within the next 5 minutes, we'll move." Elara turned to him, surprise flickering across her face. "You're serious?" Aiden nodded. "I am. But we're not moving until we have no other choice." Elara hesitated for a moment before giving a sharp nod. "Understood." As she moved to prepare the hidden fleet, Aiden turned back to the tactical screen. The colony was still holding, but barely. The rogue faction ships were closing in, their attacks growing more coordinated. The human fleet was being pushed to the brink. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, a message came through. "Commander, reinforcements are arriving. The fleet from Station Theta is dropping out of hyperspace now." Aiden exhaled, the weight of the decision lifting slightly. The reinforcements had arrived. The line would hold. For now. The council chambers were abuzz, filled with the clamor of raised voices and hurried footsteps. News traveled fast in the corridors of power, and the latest leak had sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. Even those who had seen it coming could barely contain their disbelief. Humanity had hidden something no one had suspected, not even the most paranoid among the Galactic Council. A fleet and entire armada of warships built in secret, concealed from every eye, shielded from every scanner. Aiden knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But the timing couldn't have been worse. He stood in the command deck of his flagship, Eclipse, staring at the incoming messages from the Council. Urgent summons, demands for answers, thinly veiled threats. "They're panicking," Elara said, her voice calm but edged with the kind of tension that came from years of diplomacy. She stood beside him, arms crossed as her eyes scanned the stream of data coming in from the Council's headquarters. It was inevitable. Inevitable. Aiden nodded but said nothing. He had been preparing for this moment for years, but the reality of it still felt raw. The galaxy had always underestimated humanity, seen them as primitive, resourceful perhaps, but never truly dangerous. That illusion was about to be shattered. "We need to respond," Elara added, her tone more urgent now. "If we don't get ahead of this, they'll spin the narrative. They'll paint us as the aggressors, and we can't afford that." Aiden looked at her for a moment. There had been a time when their conversations were more terse, more confrontational. She had always been the one pushing for immediate action, for transparency, while he had chosen patience and restraint. Now, the urgency in her voice wasn't born out of frustration or disagreement. It was genuine concern for what was to come. "We'll respond," Aiden said, finally breaking his silence. "But on our terms. Let them speculate for a while." The Council's frantic messaging was just background noise now. His focus was elsewhere, on the true task at hand. The hidden fleet, their fleet was about to be revealed to the galaxy, not through words, but through action. The rogue faction had been beaten back, but they weren't defeated. Reports had come in from several colonies along the outer rim. Coordinated attacks, well-funded and well-supplied. Whoever was behind the faction had access to resources that rivaled even the most established galactic powers. They weren't random marauders. They were something far more dangerous, and they had plans. "We're ready," Elara said, her voice softer now. She looked at Aiden with a new kind of understanding in her eyes. "Aren't we?" Aiden met her gaze. She had always known the fleet existed, had even argued for its use on more than one occasion. But now, with the Council breathing down their necks and the galaxy's eyes turning toward Earth, he could see that she understood something deeper. The weight of leadership, the burden of command. There was a reason Aiden had kept the fleet hidden for so long. Power, once revealed, could never be taken back. It wasn't just about keeping the element of surprise or maintaining a strategic advantage. It was about what the fleet represented, a shift in the balance of power that could ripple across the galaxy. Once humanity's hidden strength was unveiled, everything would change. "Let's move," Aiden said, turning to the crew. "Prepare the fleet for departure. We'll strike before they have a chance to regroup." Elara nodded, stepping forward to relay the orders. The command deck came alive with activity, officers moving with a sense of purpose and urgency. The hidden fleet, hundreds of ships, each one a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance, had been hidden in plain sight, scattered across uninhabited systems, cloaked and camouflaged to appear as nothing more than derelict stations or asteroid fields. Now, they were coming together for the first time. The eclipse moved through the void of space with a silent grace, its dark hull absorbing the starlight around it. It was the flagship of the hidden fleet, designed for stealth and power in equal measure. Unlike the ships of the known human fleet, the eclipse and her sister vessels had been built with technology that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, the most advanced alien armadas. As the fleet converged, one by one the ships emerged from their hiding places, sleek, dark forms that blended into the surrounding void. They moved with precision, forming up into a tight formation around the eclipse, their engines humming with a quiet, deadly energy. Aiden stood at the helm, watching the tactical screen as the fleet took shape. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where humanity would show the galaxy what they were truly capable of. Elara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. For all their past differences, they had come to this point together. She had always questioned his decisions, pushed him to act sooner, but now she seemed to understand the gravity of what they were about to do. "Aiden," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ship. "When this is over, everything will be different." He nodded. "I know." There was no turning back now. The hidden fleet was about to be revealed, and with it, humanity's place in the galaxy would be forever changed. "Commander," one of the officers called out, "we're receiving a transmission from the Council. They're demanding an explanation for the fleet." Aiden didn't even look at the screen. "Ignore it. We have more important things to deal with." The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding and returning to his station. Elara glanced at him. "You know they won't take that well." "They don't have to." Aiden's focus was on the battle ahead. The rogue faction had regrouped, and their forces were gathering in a system just beyond the outer colonies. They weren't expecting a response from humanity, not after the losses they had inflicted in the previous skirmish. But they didn't know about the hidden fleet. Not yet. "We'll hit them hard and fast," Aiden said, his voice steady. "Take out their command ships first, then cripple their supply lines. They'll be scattered and disorganized before they even realize what's happening." Elara nodded, her gaze hardening as she focused on the tactical screen. "And when the Council comes knocking, we'll deal with that when the time comes." The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just another battle, it was the beginning of something far greater. Aiden could feel it, and he knew Elara could too. The galaxy had always underestimated humanity, but that was about to change. "Fleet is in position," the officer reported. "We're ready to engage on your command." Aiden took a deep breath, his mind focused on the task at hand. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. "Engage," he ordered. The fleet moved with precision, their engines roaring to life as they surged forward. The eclipse led the charge, its sleek form cutting through the darkness like a blade. Behind it, hundreds of ships followed, their weapons primed and ready. The rogue faction's forces didn't know what hit them. The first salvo was devastating. The hidden fleet's weapons were more advanced than anything the rogue faction had encountered. Energy beams sliced through their ships with pinpoint accuracy, tearing through their hulls and disabling their systems before they even had a chance to react. Aiden watched the battle unfold on the tactical screen, his expression calm but focused. The rogue ships scrambled to form a defense, but it was too late. The hidden fleet had already crippled their command vessels, leaving them leaderless and disorganized. Elara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the screen. For the first time, Aiden saw a hint of awe in her expression. She had always believed in the fleet's power, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. "They didn't stand a chance," she said quietly. "They never do," Aiden replied. "That's the point." The battle was brutal but swift. The hidden fleet moved with a level of coordination that left no room for error. Every move was calculated, every shot precise. Within minutes, the rogue faction's forces were in full retreat, their ships limping away from the battlefield, broken and battered. "Pursue them," Aiden ordered. "Don't let any of them escape." The fleet surged forward again, cutting down the fleeing ships with ruthless efficiency. There would be no survivors. No one would be left to warn the rest of the galaxy about what had happened here. Aiden's eyes scanned the screen, watching as the last of the rogue ships were destroyed. It was over. The battle had been won. But the real fight was just beginning. Hours later, the command deck was quiet. The battle had ended, and the fleet was regrouping, preparing for the next phase. Aiden stood at the helm, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The hidden fleet had been revealed, and the galaxy would soon know the truth. There was no hiding it now. Humanity had shown its hand, and the Council would be forced to respond. Elara stood beside him, her arms crossed as she watched the tactical screen. "You were right," she said after a long silence. Aiden glanced at her. "About what?" "About waiting. About not revealing the fleet too soon. I didn't understand it before, but now I see it." There was a weight to her words that hadn't been there before. Aiden could hear the change in her voice, the shift in her perspective. She had always been driven, always pushing for immediate action, but now she seemed to understand the bigger picture. "The galaxy isn't ready for what's coming," Aiden said quietly, "but they'll have to be." Elara nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "We will be." For the first time, Aiden felt a sense of mutual respect between them. They had fought side by side, and in doing so, had come to understand each other in a way that words could never convey. There was still so much left to do, so many battles yet to be fought, but for now they had won a victory not just against their enemies, but within themselves. And the galaxy would never be the same again. Aiden stood in front of the imposing council chamber's doors. He'd been briefed by intelligence on the internal divisions forming among the Galactic Council. The revelation of humanity's hidden fleet had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. What had been a covert rumor was now undeniable fact. The humans were not to be dismissed as a minor species, but a force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the greatest powers of the galaxy. Elara walked beside him, her expression more measured than it had been in earlier confrontations. There was a calmness in her now that had replaced the fiery impatience she'd once harbored. Their recent battle against the rogue faction, where the hidden fleet had finally been deployed, had solidified her understanding of the gravity behind Aiden's calculated patience. She hadn't fully understood the weight of leadership until that moment, when lives hung in the balance of every decision. The massive doors hissed open. The chamber beyond was a vast, circular room with towering columns, each representing one of the galaxy's most influential species. The council members were already seated in their respective sectors, divided into factions of their own. Some eyes narrowed at Aiden and Elara's entrance. The knowledge of the hidden fleet had shifted their perspectives, but it was still unclear how each of these powerful individuals would react. There were whispers and flickers of communication between the various species as the humans took their places. The head of the council, a towering figure from the Althar species, raised a hand, silencing the murmur of conversation. He was known for his cold pragmatism and an unyielding sense of galactic order. "Humanity," the Althar leader began, his voice resonating through the chamber. "We have convened here because of the recent revelation of your hidden fleet. This council demands an explanation." Aiden stood, his calm, composed demeanor unwavering. He had spent years preparing for this moment. He knew what was at stake. "The fleet was a necessity, not a choice," Aiden began. "We have been aware of the threats lurking in the shadows of this galaxy. We understood that revealing our strength too early would place us at risk of preemptive strikes by those who seek to maintain the status quo. Humanity does not desire war, but we will not remain defenseless. A council member from the Apharian delegation, an amphibious species known for their diplomatic prowess, leaned forward. So, you admit that you've been preparing for conflict. How can we trust you when you've been hiding your true capabilities all this time? Aiden met the Apharian's gaze steadily. We did what we had to in order to survive. You all know the nature of this galaxy. Power is the only language understood by many. If humanity revealed our hand too early, we would have been crushed before we even had a chance to stand. The tension in the room was palpable. The Council had always been wary of humanity's potential, but now that potential was fully realized, and it terrified many of them. A faction leader from the Dronar, a warlike species, stood up, his massive form casting a shadow over the Council. His kind had long been advocates of might as a means of galactic dominance. You speak of defense, human, he growled. But that fleet of yours, it's an armada, not a defensive measure. Are you preparing to wage war against the Council? Elara, sensing the shift in the tone of the conversation, stepped forward. Her voice was calm, measured completely unlike the more impulsive persona she had once displayed. The fleet exists because of the dangers that we all face. We are not the only species that has encountered the rogue factions, the ones who seek to destabilize this galaxy. If we fall, they will come for you next. What we have built is not just for humanity's defense, but for the galaxy's future. The Council murmured again, some in agreement, others in growing suspicion. The Alfar leader interjected, raising a hand for silence. The truth is that your secrecy has sown distrust among us. There are those here who believe that humanity's rise threatens the balance we have fought to maintain. Others see opportunity in aligning with your strength. The question we must address now is whether humanity will be allowed to continue as it has, unregulated, unchecked. Aiden knew this was the crux of the issue. The Council wasn't simply afraid of the fleet. They were afraid of losing control. For centuries, they had ruled with an iron hand, dictating the course of galactic affairs. Humanity's rise, their hidden strength, was a challenge to that status quo. One of the younger Council members, from the highly intellectual yet pacifist Venai species, spoke up. Perhaps there is a middle path. Humanity has proven their capability, but trust must be rebuilt. What if the fleet was placed under Council oversight? A shared responsibility to ensure that its power is not misused. Elara's eyes flashed. She had grown calmer, more diplomatic, but the idea of handing over humanity's hard-earned strength to the Council was an insult. Aiden, however, remained steady. The fleet is humanity's responsibility, he said firmly. We have no intention of misusing it. But let me be clear, we will not submit our sovereignty to this Council. We are willing to work with you to protect this galaxy from the greater threats that loom. But the fleet remains under our command. The room grew cold with the weight of his words. Some of the Council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Dronar leader sneered, clearly dissatisfied with Aiden's refusal. You humans think you can stand against us all if we decide otherwise? The Dronar growled. Aiden didn't flinch. I think that's a question you don't want to know the answer to. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Aiden's statement wasn't a threat, but it left an unspoken warning hanging in the air. The Council had to weigh their options carefully now. Humanity was no longer a passive player in the galactic game. They had the power to defend themselves, and more importantly, to retaliate. The Althar leader, ever pragmatic, tapped his clawed fingers against the stone table. It seems, then, that we are at an impasse. We cannot ignore the threat that humanity poses to the established order, but neither can we deny your potential as an ally. Aiden nodded subtly. This was the outcome he had anticipated. He wasn't here to dominate or force the Council into submission. He was here to secure humanity's position on equal footing. We are not asking for war, Aiden reiterated. We are offering cooperation. But know this: humanity will not be bullied or subjugated. Elara watched closely as the council members exchanged glances. The factions had been set. Some, like the Etherians and the Veni, seemed willing to consider diplomacy and cooperation. Others, like the Draenei, would never accept humanity as equals. And still, there were those like the Althar who remained on the fence, waiting to see which way the winds of power would shift. The meeting concluded with no firm resolution, but Aiden knew they had made their point. Humanity was not to be trifled with. As he and Elara left the chamber, walking back toward their shuttle, she turned to him. "You handled that well," she said, her voice soft with newfound respect. "I didn't think they'd bend so easily." "They haven't bent yet," Aiden replied, "but they will." Aiden and Elara made their way back to the shuttle bay in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The council meeting had left its mark, but they both knew this was just the beginning. The subtle shifts in power and the veiled threats they had encountered today would soon give way to more overt actions. The Galactic Council was not a body that accepted change easily, especially not when it came to challenges against their authority, and humanity had just painted a target on itself. As they stepped into the shuttle, the metallic doors sliding shut behind them with a hiss, Elara broke the silence. Her voice was lower than usual, carrying the weight of the council's tensions. "You think the Althar leader is buying what we're selling?" she asked, leaning against the bulkhead. There was something tired in her posture, though it wasn't exhaustion. More like a realization, a deeper understanding of the stakes they were now playing with. Aiden adjusted the comms device on his wrist before responding, taking his time with the words. "The Althar are practical. They care about maintaining the balance, not about doing what's right or just. If they see us as a threat to that balance, they'll act. But right now, they don't see us as a threat, just a potential disruption." He glanced at her, studying the way her brow furrowed slightly, how her eyes seemed more distant than usual. "We've got a little time, not much, but enough to maneuver." Elara crossed her arms, staring at the wall for a moment before pushing off and pacing across the shuttle's floor. "And the Draenei. I felt like they were ready to leap across the room and rip our throats out. How long before they act?" "Not long," Aiden said plainly. "The Draenei only understand force. They won't be able to resist testing our strength, especially after what they saw today. They'll come for us, but we'll be ready." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "We have to be." Elara stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression hard to read. The fire that had once fueled her confrontations with Aiden had cooled, replaced by something more calculating. "What about the Veni?" she asked. "They're pacifists, but that doesn't mean they won't try to undermine us in other ways. They might not go to war, but they could cripple our alliances or sabotage our tech." Aiden considered it for a moment. "The Veni are tricky, but they'll only act if they feel humanity poses a direct threat to their pacifist ideals. If we stay the course, show them we're not interested in war for war's sake, they might leave us alone. But if they think we're destabilizing the galaxy, they'll act in subtler ways. We'll need to keep an eye on them." Elara nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the complexity of their situation. The different factions of the council each had their own motivations, their own desires, and none of them could be ignored. Every alien species had its reasons for wanting to maintain the status quo, and humanity was now the wild card threatening that stability. As the shuttle lifted off, the faint hum of the engines filled the space, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of tension still hanging in the air. The shuttle's window showed the planet below, a gleaming sphere of technological marvels and ancient structures, home to the most powerful beings in the galaxy. It was hard to believe that humanity's future rested on the fragile negotiations that had taken place within those chambers. "You ever wonder," Elara began softly, not looking at him, "if we're doing the right thing?" Aiden glanced at her, surprised by the question. Elara had always been brash, confident, ready to act at a moment's notice. This quiet introspection wasn't like her. "The right thing?" he asked. She leaned against the window, eyes tracing the skyline of the council's capital. "Pushing humanity this far, putting us on the front lines of galactic politics. We're playing a dangerous game, And it's not just our lives on the line, it's everyone's. Aiden's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a trace of emotion that he rarely let surface. This was never about right or wrong, he said, his voice even. It's about survival. Humanity's always had to fight for its place. We're just playing by the rules of this galaxy now. Elara frowned. But is it worth it? All this secrecy, all this power. It feels like we've lost something along the way. When we started this, it was about protecting Earth. Now, I'm not so sure what it's about anymore. Aiden's gaze softened slightly. It's still about protecting Earth, but the stakes have changed. We're not just defending ourselves from outside threats anymore. We've become part of the equation. The galaxy won't leave us alone, not after what they've seen. We either rise to meet the challenge, or we get crushed under it. Elara was quiet for a moment, her expression troubled but thoughtful. I just wonder if we're still the same people we were when we started this, or if we've become something else, something like them. Aiden didn't answer immediately. He knew what she meant. The weight of leadership had changed them both, in ways neither of them had anticipated. The decisions they made now weren't just about survival, they were about power, control, and influence. The very things that had corrupted so many other species across the galaxy. The very things that had led to the rise of the Galactic Council itself. He stood, moving toward the cockpit as the shuttle prepared to dock with their ship. We are who we've always been, Aiden said, his voice quiet but firm. We're human, and that's what makes us different from them. Elara watched him go, the words lingering in the air long after he had spoken them. She wasn't so sure anymore. When they returned to their flagship, the tension aboard was palpable. The crew had been monitoring the council meeting from a distance, and now that Aiden and Elara were back, the whispers and speculations grew louder. Commander Aiden, one of the officers said, saluting him as he entered the command center. The council's response? Aiden gave a brief nod, moving toward the central console. As expected, they're divided, and they're trying to figure out how to handle us. We've bought ourselves some time, but not much. The Dronar will likely make a move soon. The officer grimaced. Understood, sir. Should we increase patrols in the outer sectors? Do it, Aiden said, and prepare the fleet. I want us ready for anything. Elara, standing beside him, looked at the holographic map of the galaxy displayed before them. It was a vast, swirling expanse of star systems and territories, each one a potential ally or enemy. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and dread at the same time. We're really doing this, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else. Aiden caught the words and gave her a sidelong glance. We've come too far to turn back now. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Elara sat at the edge of her bunk, staring out at the stars. The vastness of space stretched out before her, endless and indifferent to the struggles of the beings that inhabited it. For the first time in a long while, she felt small and uncertain. She had always been the one who charged headfirst into danger, who didn't hesitate when the odds were stacked against her. But now, with the weight of the galaxy pressing down on them, the enormity of what they were doing was beginning to sink in. They weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy, and that was a battle that could change everything. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, a soft chime echoed through the room. She glanced at the door, surprised by the interruption. "Come in," she called out. The door slid open, revealing Aiden standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't here on official business. "I thought you might want to talk," he said, stepping inside. Elara smiled faintly, motioning for him to sit. "Since when did you become the one for late-night conversations?" Aiden sat across from her, his gaze steady. "Since I realized we're both carrying a lot more weight than we used to." She nodded, her smile fading as the seriousness of his words settled in. "Yeah, it feels like everything's changed." "It has," Aiden agreed, "but that doesn't mean we've lost ourselves." Elara met his eyes, searching for the truth in his words. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Not just as soldiers or leaders, but as humans. And for now, that was enough. Aiden sat alone in the dimly lit command center. The soft hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that filled the space, a steady backdrop that had become so familiar it was almost comforting. Yet tonight, there was something different in the air. He couldn't quite place it, but it felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that made you instinctively brace yourself for whatever was coming. The screens in front of him flickered with incoming data, routine patrol reports, communications from Earth, updates on the Council's movements. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Aiden's mind wasn't on the present. It was on the whispers. The message from the Silent Watchers had arrived earlier that day, delivered in a way that was as unsettling as it was cryptic. They hadn't spoken directly. No voice, no image. Just a single line transmitted through one of the ship's communication systems. A simple message that had appeared and then disappeared before anyone else could see it. You're not the only ones watching. Aiden had read it at least a dozen times, hoping to uncover some hidden meaning, some clue as to who the Watchers were or what they wanted. But all it did was raise more questions. Questions that left a pit in his stomach, a nagging fear that they were playing a game he didn't fully understand. He stared at the words again, now burned into his memory. You're not the only ones watching. It made him uneasy in a way nothing else had. Humanity had fought for survival for centuries, clawing its way to a place of power among the stars. But this was different. It wasn't an enemy they could see, or a battle they could prepare for. It was something beyond their control. The door slid open quietly, and Elara stepped in. She glanced at him, then at the empty space around him, her expression softening as she took in the scene. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. Aiden gave a small nod. "Couldn't sleep." She walked over and sat down beside him, leaning back in her chair. "The Silent Watchers, right?" Aiden didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Elara knew him well enough to understand when something was gnawing at him. He was always the composed one, the calm in the chaos. But even he had his limits. "You know," Elara began, breaking the silence, "when I first heard about them, the Watchers, I thought it was just some myth. A story passed around to keep people in line. But now—" She trailed off, glancing at the screens in front of them. "Now, I'm not so sure." Aiden exhaled, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking the same thing. If they're real, if they've been watching us this whole time, why now? Why reach out to us now?" Elara shrugged, her gaze distant. "Maybe they think we're finally worth watching." There was something raw in her voice, an edge of vulnerability she rarely showed. For all her strength and fire, even Elara wasn't immune to the creeping sense of dread that came with the unknown. She had faced death 100 times, but this was different. This was something that couldn't be fought with weapons or strategy. It was bigger than them, bigger than the Council, bigger than humanity's place in the galaxy. Aiden ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. "What if we're just pawns?" he said quietly. "What if this whole time, we've been playing a game we didn't even know we were part of?" Elara looked at him sharply, the softness in her eyes replaced by a fierceness he recognized all too well. "We're not pawns, Aiden. We never have been. We've fought for everything we've got. We didn't get here because someone let us. We took our place in this galaxy. If they think they can manipulate us, they're wrong." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to hold on to that certainty, to the belief that they were in control of their own fate. But the doubt lingered. The Silent Watchers had cast a shadow over everything, and no matter how much he tried to push it aside, it was there. The idea that there were forces out there, forces older, more powerful, more mysterious, watching, waiting, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Elara must have sensed his hesitation because her expression softened again, her voice dropping to a gentler tone. "Hey, look," she said, leaning closer. "I get it. This is different. But we've faced impossible odds before. We've been outnumbered, outgunned, and we're still standing. We've survived because we don't give in to fear." Aiden turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. There was something comforting in the way she looked at him, a quiet strength that reminded him of why they had come this far in the first place. She was right. Fear wasn't what had kept humanity alive. It was their ability to adapt, to rise to every challenge, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, his voice steadier. "But this feels different." Elara tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "It is different, but that doesn't mean we're not ready for it." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the unknown hanging between them like a dark cloud. Aiden could feel the tension building in his chest, the slow, steady rise of unease that came with the realization that their fight wasn't just against the Council or the other factions in the galaxy. There was something more, something deeper at play. "What do you think they want?" Aiden asked quietly, almost to himself. Elara didn't answer right away. She stared out at the stars, her gaze thoughtful. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "But whatever it is, they're not going to get it without a fight." Aiden chuckled softly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's the Elara I know." She grinned back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The uncertainty was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. Later that night, alone in his quarters, Aiden lay on his bunk, staring up at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the stars outside his window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something they couldn't see or predict. The silent watchers were out there, watching, waiting, and Aiden couldn't help but wonder if they were being toyed with. He closed his eyes, trying to quiet his mind, but the questions wouldn't stop. Were they really in control of their fate? Or had they been caught in the web of something far more dangerous, far more powerful than they had ever imagined? And as sleep finally claimed him, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. The silent watchers weren't done with them yet. Aiden's mind refused to let go, spinning in the darkness as sleep remained just out of reach. The cryptic message from the silent watchers had lodged itself deep within him, gnawing at his thoughts like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. He knew the galaxy was vast, filled with unknown dangers and ancient powers, but the idea of being watched, of being manipulated, was something else entirely. He tossed in his bunk, shifting uncomfortably as his thoughts raced. His decision to hold the hidden fleet in reserve, the battles they'd fought, and the lives lost, every choice felt like it had been leading to this point. Was it all part of some grander plan? Had the silent watchers been guiding them without their knowledge, steering them like pieces on a board? The weight of leadership felt heavier than ever tonight. Aiden wasn't a man who doubted easily. His life had been built on hard decisions, each one carved from experience, logic, and gut instinct. But this was something else. His hand clenched unconsciously into a fist as he remembered the words again. "You're not the only ones watching." It wasn't just the warning that bothered him. It was the implication that there were others out there, unseen and unknown, who had been observing humanity from the shadows. For how long? And why now, when humanity was finally beginning to stand on its own in the galaxy? In the quiet of his quarters, he began to consider the deeper ramifications. Maybe it wasn't just a threat. Maybe it was a challenge. A test of whether humanity was truly ready to take its place in the stars. If that were the case, what would they be asked to prove? Their strength, their wisdom, their ability to survive against something far greater than themselves. The idea that they might be pawns was almost too much to bear. Aiden had always believed that humanity could shape its own destiny, no matter the odds. That belief had carried him through the darkest moments, through battles that should have been lost and impossible decisions that tore at his soul. But now, for the first time, he wondered if they had been naive. He rose from his bunk, moving to the window that looked out onto the endless stretch of stars. The galaxy, in all its vastness, had never seemed so empty. Somewhere out there, the silent watchers were observing, waiting. Aiden stared into the void, his jaw tight, his mind racing through the possibilities. What were they waiting for? What were they planning? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the stars flickered in the distance. Aiden knew one thing for certain: whatever was coming, it was inevitable. They could no longer sit in the shadows. Sooner or later, they would have to face the silent watchers, and when that time came, they needed to be ready. His hands rested against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface slightly as he exhaled. They would find out soon enough what the silent watchers truly wanted. Until then, Aiden would do what he had always done: prepare, strategize, and never allow fear to dictate his choices. Because if the silent watchers thought they could manipulate humanity, they were in for a surprise. The hum of the command room filled the air, vibrating with tension. Aiden stood in the center, surrounded by holographic displays flashing warnings and real-time updates. Elara was at his side, her face set in grim determination as the galaxy began to fracture before their eyes. The Galactic War had not been predicted, not even by the silent watchers. Factions within the Council, pushed to the edge by internal struggles and external pressure, had finally cracked. Alliances that had held the galaxy in fragile balance now splintered, and old rivalries were reignited. It wasn't long before humanity found itself entangled, the hidden fleet suddenly thrust into a war that wasn't their own. "Council ships are closing in," an officer called out, pointing to the flashing markers on the map. Elara's eyes followed the movement. "This was never about peace," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. The truth of it settled like a weight in her chest. They had never been trusted. This war might have sparked elsewhere, but humanity had always been a threat lingering on the horizon. Aiden's fingers tapped rhythmically against the console, his mind racing through the strategies. They had prepared for this, in some form or another, but it wasn't the way he had hoped to reveal their strength, not like this. The hidden fleet, a masterpiece of human ingenuity, was no longer a secret, and now it had to prove its worth. It wasn't just their survival at stake anymore, it was their place in the galaxy. "Elara, take command of the fleet's offensive. We need to break through their lines and create space," Aiden ordered, his voice low but steady. She nodded, her hesitation from weeks ago replaced with a fierce certainty. She had learned under his guidance, yes, but she had also found her own strength, her own vision of leadership. As she stepped forward to relay his commands, there was no doubt in her stride. The battle erupted across the starfields, a chaotic and brutal dance of fire and metal. Ships clashed in a violent storm, energy beams slicing through space like a deadly symphony. The hidden fleet, crafted in the shadows, now lit up the stars with its power. Massive vessels that had been unseen by the galaxy for so long roared to life, their sleek forms maneuvering with precision and terrifying force. Elara's voice cut through the cacophony, issuing commands with clarity and control. "Pull back Formation C. Focus fire on the cruisers breaking through Sector 3. Her orders were swift, her mind locked into the flow of battle. But for every victory, there was a cost. Aiden watched as ships fell, human lives lost in a war they hadn't wanted. His strategy had been sound, but the weight of each sacrifice pressed harder against him with every moment. He had hoped to avoid this, to keep humanity's power a secret until they could control the narrative. Now, that control had slipped away, and with it, the lines between protector and aggressor blurred. "They're pushing us into a corner," Elara said, her eyes narrowing as another wave of council ships appeared on the scanners. "They want to see how far we're willing to go. And we have to decide how much to show them," Aiden replied quietly, his thoughts darker than ever before. The fleet was their last card to play. If they revealed too much, they risked being seen as a threat beyond negotiation, a force that had to be contained at any cost. But if they held back, humanity could be destroyed before they ever had the chance to stand. The council factions were divided. Some still viewed humanity as a potential ally, but others had already decided that Earth's growing power needed to be crushed. The fragile alliances that Aiden had worked so hard to maintain were breaking under the strain of war. The heat of battle wasn't the only fire burning. Within Aiden, a deeper conflict raged. The power at his fingertips was immense, the tools of destruction they had built now unleashed. But with that power came responsibility, a burden that he had always carried, but now felt more acutely than ever. Should they, use it to its full extent? Elara's voice cut through his thoughts again. Aiden, we have to act now. They won't stop until we force them to. We need to strike harder. Her tone was different now. This wasn't the same Elara who had once looked to him for every answer. She had come into her own, and her frustration was palpable. She wanted to push forward, to show the galaxy what humanity could do. He saw it in her eyes, the same fire that had burned in him when he had first taken command. But Aiden wasn't ready to give in to that impulse. Not yet. We can't lose sight of the bigger picture, Elara, he replied, his voice calm but firm. We need to be more than just another faction vying for power. More than just another faction, she repeated, her temper flaring for a moment. Aiden, we're in the middle of a war. If we don't act, we'll be crushed. This isn't the time for holding back. Aiden held her gaze. And what happens after we win, if we show them everything now? What will they think of us then? Do you really believe they'll let us walk away after they've seen what we're capable of? Elara's jaw clenched. She knew he was right, but the fire within her wouldn't be extinguished so easily. She had tasted power, had seen the potential they held, and it called to her. So what's the plan? How long do we hold back? Aiden didn't have a perfect answer. There was no perfect answer. But that didn't stop him from searching for it. We fight, but we fight on our terms. We'll give them enough to survive this battle, but not everything. Elara turned back to the displays, her frustration still simmering. She had learned much from Aiden, but now she was forging her own path. And as she watched the galaxy burn around them, she began to understand the weight of the choices Aiden had made all these years. The war was fierce, unrelenting, and the Hidden Fleet's power was undeniable. But Aiden's restraint became more difficult to maintain with each passing moment. Elara had been right about one thing: the galaxy wasn't going to stop testing them. The Council's factions were bent on pushing humanity to its limits, and eventually they would have to make a stand. As the battle raged on, Aiden found himself standing at the precipice of an impossible choice. Could they truly hold back and survive? Or was it time to unleash the full might of the fleet? Consequences be damned. Elara's growth had shown her the brutal realities of leadership. Her desire for action, her impatience for recognition, had been tempered by the grim truth that power wasn't always enough. The decisions they faced weren't just about winning the war, they were about what kind of future they would create in the aftermath. Together, they fought side by side, navigating the storm of battle with the weight of humanity's future pressing down on their shoulders. And as the final hours of the conflict neared, the lines between right and wrong, strength and restraint, became harder to define. The galaxy was watching, and their next move would define humanity's place in it for generations to come. The stars flickered ominously in the distance, as if reflecting the tenuous state of the galaxy itself. Aiden stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the endless array of incoming threats. Ships from every faction converged, drawn to the battle like vultures to a carcass. The fleet, once hidden, was now exposed to the unforgiving expanse, its strength both a beacon of hope and a mark of danger. He had held on for as long as possible, weighed down by decisions that grew heavier with each passing hour. His usual composure, the mask he had worn so flawlessly, was beginning to fracture. The calculations he once trusted felt inadequate, overtaken by the unpredictable nature of this war. It wasn't just about tactics anymore. It was about survival on the edge of collapse. Elara, standing beside him, was no longer the inexperienced lieutenant who had once questioned every move. Now, she took command with the ease and confidence of someone who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. She gave orders without hesitation, her voice calm, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. The war had shaped her, but it hadn't broken her. Fleet 3 needs support. They won't hold on much longer, Elara reported, her fingers gliding over the console. Aiden nodded. Send reinforcement from Quadrant 7. We can't afford to lose any more ships there. As she relayed the commands, Aiden felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest. Every decision cost lives. Every call could be the one that tipped the scales. He had tried to keep a distance, to remain detached enough to think clearly, but the lines were starting to blur. Faces he didn't know haunted him. Voices of those he couldn't save lingered in the back of his mind. The pressure was building. The galaxy seemed to conspire against them, pushing humanity into a corner with no escape. His thoughts drifted to the Council, those who had been too short-sighted to see the threat they now faced. Factions fighting amongst themselves had allowed this chaos to fester, and now everyone was paying the price. Enemy ships are repositioning, Elara said, breaking through his internal storm. They're pushing for the core fleet. They think they can finish us off, Aiden muttered under his breath. They're testing our defenses. But it wasn't just an external threat. The tension within their own ranks was growing. Not everyone shared Aiden's view of restraint. Whispers had begun to circulate rumors that they could end the war decisively if they unleashed their full strength. He had heard the quiet talks of desperation, the belief that their only chance lay in overwhelming force. But Aiden knew the consequences of such a move. If they went too far, they might win this battle but lose everything else. They're going to hit us harder, Elara warned, pulling his attention back to the moment. We need to make a choice. Aiden stared at the display, seeing the inevitable unfolding before him. The enemy was coming, and they weren't holding back. He could sense the urgency in the air, the silent expectation from those around him. Prepare the heavy artillery, Aiden said after a long pause. Elara glanced at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Are we really doing this? We're not out of options yet, Aiden said, more to convince himself than anyone else. But we have to make them think we are. He turned toward the screen, watching as the enemy drew nearer, their ships like a wall of destruction moving toward them. His mind churned through the possibilities, weighing each decision like a balance with no perfect answer. Elara's transformation was more than just experience. There was a resilience in her now, a willingness to face whatever came, even if the outcome was uncertain. She had become what he had once feared, a leader willing to take risks, to stand at the forefront with no guarantee of victory. Aiden admired her for it, but it also made his own path harder to bear. As the first wave of enemy fire hit their outer defenses, the ship shook violently, alarms blaring across the deck. The crew scrambled to their stations, working with the precision and focus that had kept them alive this long. But there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Everyone knew they were on borrowed time. Elara's voice remained steady as she coordinated the counterattack, her commands clear and efficient. Redirect shields to Sector 9. We can't let them break through there. Aiden watched her closely, the weight of his own indecision bearing down on him. He had always been the one in control, the one making the tough calls. But now, as they stood on the brink, he wasn't sure if his choices would be enough. Do you think this is it? Elara asked quietly, her eyes still on the battle. Aiden didn't answer right away. His mind wandered, not to the battlefield in front of him, but to the future. He had always believed in the resilience of humanity, in their ability to adapt and overcome. But now, in the face of such overwhelming odds, he began to wonder if he had miscalculated. We've come too far to turn back, he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. Whatever happens next, we have to see it through. Elara nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was a shared understanding between them, a recognition of the burden they both carried. The galaxy was watching, and every move they made would shape the future of humanity. The battle raged on, each moment a test of their strength, their resolve, and their faith in one another. But the real battle was still to come, the one that would decide not just their survival, but their place in a galaxy that seemed determined to destroy them. And as Aiden watched the enemy ships closing in, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something far greater than war. Something that would redefine everything they had fought for. The silence between battles was always unsettling. It was the kind of quiet that wrapped around the ship, thick and suffocating, the calm before the inevitable storm. Aiden stood alone in the command room, staring out into the void beyond. The stars, distant and cold, seemed indifferent to the struggle unfolding across the galaxy. But there, in that silent expanse, he felt something else, something waiting. It had been days since the war reached its peak, and though the conflict still raged, Aiden found himself questioning the path ahead. He'd always known that leadership came with sacrifices, but now, with each decision, the weight grew heavier. The fleet, once a symbol of humanity's strength, now felt like a fragile barrier against the vast unknown. He had trusted in their ingenuity, their resilience. But the message from the Silent Watchers lingered in the back of his mind like a thorn he couldn't remove. The Silent Watchers, a name spoken in hushed tones among the most ancient civilizations, entities that existed outside the bounds of known reality. They had always been shrouded in mystery, never interfering directly, only observing. But why now? Why send a message to him, of all people? And what did they want? A faint beep from the console interrupted his thoughts. The screen blinked to life, revealing a simple message: "You are not what you think you are." Aiden's heart skipped. He stared at the words, a chill creeping down his spine. He hadn't asked for this revelation, hadn't sought out their wisdom. Yet, here it was, another cryptic message, another puzzle in an already impossible situation. He sat down, his fingers trembling as he keyed in a response. "What do you mean?" The reply came almost instantly, as if they had been waiting. "Humanity was not born by chance. You were created for a purpose." Aiden felt his pulse quicken. Created? Purpose? It was absurd. And yet, deep down, something about the message rang true. He had always felt that humanity's rapid evolution, their relentless drive, was different from the other species in the galaxy. The others, even the most advanced civilizations, had developed at a pace that seemed natural, gradual. But humanity had grown too fast, too fiercely, as if something had pushed them toward greatness. "What purpose?" Aiden typed, his hands unsteady. The seconds stretched out before the screen flickered again. "To face what is to come. The threat you know is only the beginning. Your survival is not an accident." Aiden's breath caught. The room felt colder, darker. He leaned back, staring at the screen as the weight of those words sank in. If humanity was created for a purpose, then their entire existence had been guided by forces beyond their control. Every choice they had made, every battle fought, every moment of triumph, it wasn't their own. They had been players in a game they didn't even know existed. He stood up, pacing the length of the room, his mind racing. The Silent Watchers were implying that everything, from the dawn of human civilization to their current war, was part of some grand design. But what kind of design? And why? The stars outside seemed to mock him with their indifference. Here he was, standing on the edge of a revelation that could change everything, and the universe continued as if nothing had happened. He felt small, insignificant in the face of such overwhelming knowledge. And yet, there was a part of him deep inside that had always suspected this truth. His mind raced through the years of conflict, the countless wars, the technological leaps that had catapulted humanity into the galactic stage. None of it had ever made sense. How could one species, from a single, unremarkable planet, rise to challenge the greatest powers in the universe? It was as if they had been designed for this. But the most unsettling thought was the idea that their future wasn't in their hands. If they had been created to face a threat, then their fate had already been decided. Free will, the foundation of human existence, seemed to crumble before his eyes. Were they truly in control of their destiny, or were they just following a path laid out by unseen forces? "What is this threat?" Aiden typed, desperate for answers. This time, the response was slower, as if the Watchers were contemplating their next words. "An enemy that exists beyond your understanding. One that has been watching, waiting. It is not bound by time, nor by the laws of your universe, and it is coming." Aiden felt a cold sweat break across his skin. An enemy beyond understanding. How could they possibly fight something like that? The galaxy's current war seemed trivial in comparison. The faction, the council, even the hidden fleet, they were all meaningless against a threat that defied reality itself. He sat down again, the weight of it all pressing on him. For the first time, the stoicism that had defined him faltered. His hands covered his face as he tried to process what this meant for humanity, for him, for everything. Had they been manipulated from the start? Was every victory, every loss, nothing more than a step toward an inevitable confrontation with something they couldn't even comprehend? The Watcher's final message appeared on the screen. You have the power to choose, but the path is narrow. Be prepared. The words hung in the air like a final warning. They were being given a choice, perhaps the only true choice they'd ever had. But what did it mean to be prepared? How could they possibly face an enemy that transcended time and space? Aiden sat there, staring at the void outside, his thoughts swirling. The weight of leadership, of responsibility, had never felt so heavy. He thought of Elara, of the fleet, of the countless lives depending on him. He had always been able to see the path ahead, to navigate through the chaos with a clear purpose. But now, as he stared into the endless abyss, he realized that the path had never been his to choose. The silence was broken by the sound of the door sliding open. Elara stepped inside, her face hardened by the recent battles, but her eyes searching for answers. "Another message?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Aiden nodded, still unable to speak. She moved closer, reading the screen, and as the gravity of the situation settled over her, she looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and determination. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly, the question hanging between them like a shadow. Aiden looked at her, searching for the right words. For the first time, he didn't have a clear answer. All he knew was that they were standing on the precipice of something far greater than they had ever imagined, and the choices they made in the coming days would determine the fate of not just humanity, but the galaxy itself. "We get ready," Aiden said finally, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty, "for whatever comes next." And as they stood together, staring into the void, the stars seemed a little less indifferent. Something was out there, waiting, and humanity would have to face it whether they were ready or not. The cold silence of space was shattered by the violent roar of engines and the deep thrum of energy cannons firing across the battlefield. The final stand had begun. All the tension, all the buildup over the past weeks of battle, had led to this moment, humanity's last stand against the alien factions that sought to crush them. The hidden fleet, a symbol of hope and strength, was now scattered across the void, struggling to hold the line against a relentless and overwhelming enemy force. Shields flickered as they absorbed hit after hit, and explosions erupted on the periphery of the fleet, marking the loss of yet another ship, another crew, another set of lives extinguished in the cold darkness. Aiden stood on the bridge of the command ship, his gaze locked on the tactical display. His eyes darted from one flashing point to the next, calculating, adjusting, searching for some way to turn the tide. Every second mattered, and every decision he made now could be the difference between survival and annihilation. "Shields on the Valiant are down to 20%, Captain," one of the officers called out. "They won't hold for long." "Pull them back to the rear line," Aiden ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Have the Resolute cover their retreat. We can't afford to lose any more ships." His hands gripped the edge of the console in front of him, the cool metal biting into his skin as he stared at the flashing lights. He knew the odds. The enemy fleet was vast, far larger than even the most pessimistic projections had estimated. They were being pushed to their limits, and the situation was deteriorating faster than he could compensate. "They're adapting," Elara said quietly from beside him, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken urgency. Her gaze was fixed on the same tactical display, but unlike Aiden, she wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a way through. She had become a force in her own right over the course of the war. The timid girl who had once looked to him for every answer was gone. In her place stood a warrior, a leader, and though Aiden had always been the strategist, always the one with the plan, it was Elara who had come to embody the spirit of humanity's defiance. She no longer followed orders blindly. She made her own decisions, fought her own battles, and carried the weight of responsibility with the same quiet determination that had once defined Aiden himself. "They always adapt," Aiden replied, his tone tinged with the exhaustion of months of relentless fighting. but so do we. Aiden turned away from the display, his mind racing as he paced the length of the bridge. His thoughts were scattered, 1,000 possibilities running through his mind, none of them offering a clear solution. Every time they had faced overwhelming odds before, they had found a way, some crack in the enemy's defenses, some vulnerability they could exploit. But this time it felt different. There was no clear path to victory, only survival, and even that seemed like a distant hope. As he walked, his gaze flicked to the viewport, where the battle raged on in brutal silence. Ships twisted and turned, firing in every direction as beams of energy sliced through the blackness. It was a deadly dance, each movement a calculated risk, each decision a matter of life and death. And at the center of it all was Aiden, the man who had led them here, the man who had promised them that they could win. But as he stared out into the void, the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. Aiden, Elara's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "We can't keep doing this. We need to make a decision." He met her gaze, and for a moment they stood in silence, the chaos of the battle fading into the background. There was no need for words, they both knew what she meant. The final decision, the one they had both avoided for as long as possible, was now staring them in the face. Aiden's chest tightened as he thought about what that decision would mean. The cost, the sacrifice. But there was no other way. The enemy was too strong, too relentless. They had pushed humanity to the edge, and now, if they wanted to survive, they would have to make a choice that would change everything. "We're running out of time," Elara continued, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "The fleet can't hold much longer, if we don't act now." "I know," Aiden interrupted, his voice hoarse. He turned back to the tactical display, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his ability to see the bigger picture, to make the hard decisions when no one else could. But this was different. He glanced at Elara again, and in her eyes he saw the same conflict, the same fear. She had grown so much over the course of the war, had taken on more than he ever thought possible. But now, as the weight of the future pressed down on them, she was just as unsure as he was. "What if we're wrong?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elara didn't hesitate. "Then we'll live with it, just like we've lived with every other choice we've made." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. They had both made sacrifices that had shaped the course of the war, sacrifices that had cost them more than they could ever repay. But now, in this final moment, they were faced with the greatest sacrifice of all. Aiden's gaze flicked back to the viewport, where the battle raged on. The enemy ships were closing in, their formations tightening as they prepared for the final push. They had seen humanity's weakness, and now they were moving in for the kill. "We can't win this," he said quietly, his voice filled with a deep, painful realization. "No," Elara agreed, her voice soft but resolute, "but we can still survive." It was the truth, the hard, painful truth they had both been avoiding. There was no victory here, only survival, and even that would come at a cost. Aiden closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. For months, he had led them, guided them, promised them that they could win. But now, as the final battle raged around them, he realized that he had been wrong. There was no winning this war, there was only surviving it. When he opened his eyes again, he found Elara watching him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She had always been his anchor, the one person he could count on when everything else fell apart. And now, as they stood on the brink of destruction, she was the one who would help him make the hardest decision of his life. "We need to use it," Elara said quietly, her voice filled with a grim determination. Aiden's chest tightened at her words. "You know what that means?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do, but it's the only way." The "it" she was referring to wasn't just any weapon. It was the ultimate fallback plan, the hidden technology they had discovered long ago, buried deep within the ruins of an ancient civilization, a technology so powerful, so dangerous, that they had sworn never to use it unless there was no other choice. And now, it seemed, there was no other choice. Aiden turned back to the tactical display, his heart pounding in his chest. The enemy fleet was closing in, their ships moving with deadly precision. The fleet couldn't hold much longer. If they didn't act now, it would be over. But the thought of using the technology, of unleashing that kind of power, it was too much to bear. They didn't fully understand what it would do, or the consequences of using it. It was a gamble, a dangerous, reckless gamble that could cost them everything. "What if it doesn't work?" Aiden asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Elara stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then we'll have done everything we could." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. She was right, of course. They had done everything they could, fought every battle, made every sacrifice. But now, in this final moment, they had to make the hardest decision of all. Aiden's chest tightened as he stared at the tactical display, the flashing lights blurring in his vision. He thought of the countless lives that had been lost, the friends they had buried, the sacrifices they had made. And now, as the enemy fleet closed in for the final blow, he realized that there was no other choice. "We'll do it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. "Prepare the weapon." Elara nodded, her expression grim but determined. She turned to the tactical console and began issuing orders, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Aiden watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision they had made. They were about to unleash a power they didn't fully understand, a weapon that could destroy not only the enemy, but themselves as well. It was a gamble, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance. As the countdown began, Aiden turned to face the viewport, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond. The battle still raged on, ships exploding in bursts of light and debris, energy beams crisscrossing the void like deadly fireworks. But in the silence of the command bridge, all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. Elara stepped beside him, her presence a steadying force. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake. The seconds ticked down, and as the weapon prepared to fire, Aiden found himself thinking about the future, about what would come after this. If there was an after, would they survive? Would humanity? Or would they be nothing more than a fleeting memory? Another lost civilization consumed by the vastness of space. The weapon fired. A blinding light filled the viewport, and for a moment, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening roar, the enemy fleet began to disintegrate. Ships exploded, one after another, consumed by the sheer force of the weapon's power. The alien ships, once so unstoppable, now crumbled into dust, their destruction a violent, beautiful spectacle. Aiden watched in stunned silence, his heart pounding in his chest. It had worked. They had survived. But at what cost? As the light faded and the battlefield fell silent, Aiden turned to Elara. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet sorrow. They had won, yes. But the price of that victory weighed heavily on them both. The final stand was over, but the war was far from finished. The dust of battle had barely settled when the weight of what they had done began to sink in. Aiden stood at the bridge, staring out into the emptiness where the enemy fleet once loomed. Now nothing but fragments drifting through the void. Victory had come, but it was hollow. There was no elation, no triumph, just silence, cold and consuming. Elara remained beside him, her eyes scanning the wreckage of ships that had once seemed invincible. Her silence spoke volumes. They both knew there was no celebration to be had. The war was over, but the wounds it had left behind were deeper than any they could heal. In the quiet of the moment, Aiden's thoughts drifted to the silent watchers, the beings who had warned them, who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations long before humanity ever touched the stars. Their cryptic message echoed in his mind, a reminder that the victory they had won was merely one piece of a much larger puzzle. Power is not the answer, nor is survival the goal. You will find your path not in the destruction of your enemies, but in the discovery of yourselves. He had dismissed those words when they first heard them, focused on the immediate threat, on saving what little remained of their species. But now, with the battlefield behind them and the future uncertain, they took on new meaning. Aiden glanced at Elara, wondering if she was thinking the same thing. "Do you ever wonder if this was all part of some larger design?" he asked quietly. She didn't respond at first, her gaze lost in the distance, perhaps still caught between the here and now and the lives they had lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost fragile. "Maybe. But whose design? Ours? The Watchers? Or something else entirely?" Aiden had no answer. That was the heart of it. No one knew. They had fought for survival, but survival wasn't the same as understanding. Power, it seemed, had its own price, and in wielding it, they had become something different, something he wasn't sure he fully recognized anymore. The cost of the war went beyond the lives lost in battle. It had altered them, shaped them into something harder, colder. What had once been noble, the fight to protect their home, their people, now felt like a distant memory, replaced by something far more complex. Was this what humanity was meant to become? A force driven by survival, endlessly carving its path through the stars, leaving destruction in its wake? "The Silent Watchers knew," Aiden said, more to himself than to Elara. "They knew what this would do to us." Elara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps that's why they stayed silent. Maybe they wanted us to learn for ourselves. Maybe they've seen this play out before." "Then what now?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. "What do we do now that the war is over? What do we become?" Elara didn't answer, because there wasn't one to give. They had won the war, but the future stretched out before them, uncertain and filled with questions. There were no maps for the path they were on, no clear answers to guide them. Humanity had survived, but in the process it had changed, and change, as Aiden had learned, came with consequences. In the silence, Aiden thought back to the ancient ruins they had discovered on long-forgotten worlds, remnants of civilizations that had once ruled the stars, just as humanity now did. Each one had been powerful, advanced, and yet each one had fallen, consumed by the same forces that had driven them to the heights of their power. Was that humanity's destiny too? To rise, to conquer, and then to fade into the backdrop of history, another fleeting moment in the galaxy's endless march forward. "Maybe that's the real question," Aiden said quietly, his eyes locked on the distant stars. "Not what we've become, but what we're meant to be." Elara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The answer, if there was one, wasn't something that could be spoken aloud. It was something they would have to discover for themselves in the days and years to come. As the two of them stood in the stillness of the bridge, watching the remnants of the battle fade into the void, Aiden felt the weight of their choices settle deeper into his chest. The future was a vast unknown, and for the first time, the path ahead felt less like a victory and more like a question that would remain unanswered for as long as humanity wandered the stars. What is our true destiny? The Silent Watchers had hinted at something larger, something more profound than the war they had just fought. But what that was, Aiden couldn't yet grasp. Perhaps no one could. Perhaps that was the point. As the ship drifted through the void, leaving behind the battlefield that had marked their greatest triumph and their greatest loss, Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that they were still at the beginning of something far more significant than they had ever realized. The war had ended, but the journey, the true journey, had only just begun. And somewhere, out in the vast expanse of the galaxy, the answer waited,